New Mexico Territory, 1883, Rio Hondo. A widow keeps her house so quiet you can hear the hinge breathe. 3 patient knocks change the air. A cowboy and his small girl bring miles. Law and weather ride close. 2 tin cups cool under the porch lantern. Settle in. This one starts soft, finishes true. Evening came down like a tired hand laying itself across the mesa, copper gone dull along the rim, the last light dragging slow as a blunted knife. The porch boards held heat from the day and gave it back stingy, little by little, into the soles of Nora Whitcomb's boots. She stood there long enough to measure the line of shadow, climbing the water barrel and the stain it made on the staves. It was a way she had of keeping time. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Small counts, small reckonings, when the big ones cut too deep. She'd mended the off-rein before supper and was finishing the near one now. The leather thawed soft from her palm, and the neat's foot sweetness hanging in the air. The yoke lay across her thighs, and nested against it, quiet as a memory, was the half-stitched saddle her husband had left behind. Thread still in the needle, a place where his hand had stopped and the world had gone on. She ran one finger along the unfinished seam, felt the rough lift of the hole he never pulled through, then set the whole business aside. Inside the house, the stove sighed and settled over the last of its coals, sending up a breath of smoke that wandered out the open door. Curious, then gave up. The room carried the warm, dry smell of old wood, creosote, and something faintly sweet she could not name anymore. On the porch table sat 2 tin cups. She'd put her own to use without thinking and poured coffee from the black pot. The other, set down years ago like a promise, had kept its chill. It kept it still. The goat pen gate gave a sorry little chime when the evening draft nosed it. Nora left the reins where they were and crossed the yard without hurry. She didn't rush much. The ground didn't reward it, and neither did grief. The pen's latch was a loop of baling wire and a stick smoothed by hands. She passed the wire once more around the post, tight enough a child couldn't snag a knuckle. The goat watched her with the made-up dignity of small stock. She scratched its jaw and listened to the metal quiver to quiet. There was a hinge at the front door that had started speaking up yesterday, a dry little voice at the 3rd inch of swing. She fetched the tin of oil, thumbed the lid, and let fall 3 drops into the throat of it. The pin drank. When she worked the door, the sound fell away to nothing. That did something in her chest, one less thing complaining, and she stood in the doorway to feel the hush of it. The sun sank a little more, and the mesa rim wore its nicked coin look, old and spent, yet somehow bright at the edges. Nora took her coffee to the porch rail and leaned a hip against it. The cup warmed her hand. Heat's a fine liar, she thought. It made things feel safe that weren't. She let herself take one long drink anyway. Enough to get through tonight, she said, not meaning coffee only. The voice came out even. It always did. A fly tried the screen and found its buzz cut short where she had patched it last winter with thread and will. Beyond the yard, the cottonwoods stood still as posts, and the windmill out past the well barely tipped its head. When it did, the light climbed it and fell away again, friendly enough. She watched the way the grass at the base had gone pale where the shadow lived all day, and thought about bringing the scythe tomorrow. That was the shape of most of her thoughts now. Small plans, 1 or 2 steps deep. Tomorrow. We'll see. A saying she had owned for some time. She went back inside because the light had thinned to the color of nickel, and there were a few chores better done before it went entirely. The kitchen was the size of a good saddle blanket, nothing wasted, everything where it knew to be. A wooden drawer below the shelf had started its old stubbornness at springtime. She didn't use it for anything important because it didn't take well to being needed. Today, with nothing pressing her shoulders but habit, she slid fingers under the pull and tugged. The drawer came out half a hand and stopped with a hard little sound. "Still you," she said. She rapped the side with her knuckles, just so, and the drawer jumped back and slammed itself home as if it held something it didn't care to lose. Nora looked at it the way one looks at a mule that won't. There was 100 reasons to pry it, 100 to leave it be. She'd leave it. Not for fear, she just didn't open things unless she meant to keep them open. Her eyes went back to the saddle on the chair. Once in the beginning she had worked a stitch or two each night, but the needle had a way of finding the tender place behind the knuckle and pricking the thought out of her. She wasn't superstitious, she was careful. It had saved more than it cost, so the thing sat and minded its own ache, and she minded hers. She set the tin cup by the other one on the porch table. The two looked like a man and a woman sitting quiet after something hard. The one with heat rising, giving off the smallest smell of roasted bean and iron. The other a shine without warmth. She imagined if she let herself, which she didn't often, that the cold cup pulled a little at hers, or hers warmed the other by some fine invisible trade. She set them an inch closer anyway, and went to fetch her darning. The thread ran across her thumb, leaving a line of pressure the same way a ring does. She had a ring once, and then she didn't. Rings didn't keep a person, work sometimes did. The sock under her hand held together politely enough, and the needle rocked and dipped, steady as a windmill on a half breeze. The day's noises thinned to the good kind. A chicken turning itself on the roost, a board correcting toward, cool, a coyote too far off to bother goats, or thought. When she finished, she set the sock where it belonged and stood in the doorway again, letting her weight rest on one heel, then the other. The porch boards under her palm felt rough and warm yet. The grain raised there caught at her skin and told her the story of knives and men's boots and years. She slid her hand along that raised story the way a person might read in the dark. No one was watching her, and she was not a woman who made a show, but she leaned the knuckles of her free hand against the door jamb and closed her eyes one heartbeat longer than a blink. Not a prayer, exactly. More a thing kept in a jar on a high shelf, taken down for the smell and put back. When she opened her eyes, the yard had some of night laid over it. The fence rails looked blacker and truer. The barrel no longer kept count. A small breeze moved over, and the goat bell gave one light shiver. Then nothing. The kind of nothing that is more companion than emptiness. You can sit a long time with a nothing like that. Nora did. Her coffee had cooled. She tasted it anyway and set the cup back down where the other waited. She thought how the cold cup could hold a lot of things. Rain if it came, luck if it wanted to, a place for a man's hand if luck ran out. She tightened her jaw against the thought. A person who had lived with a loss long enough could feel its size without putting a name to it. Names were heavier than they seemed. Out by the windmill the ladder leaned. Tomorrow she might take a wrench to the bolts and level the head again. The vein had a drift to it when the breeze came from the east. You could hear the quirk in the rhythm. She made a list in her mind. Windmill bolts, scythe the long grass, check the trough for seep, knock the door latch flat where it had sprung. The small repairs were decent company. They asked for her and answered back. She remembered, without wanting to, a laugh that used to move through this yard. Not big, not much for show, just there in the way of a man content to be tired. There was a day, he had said, home by dusk, and then the world proved him wrong. Nights came after that like wagons rolling over the same rutted road. You could count them and still not know when the road would smooth. She took the oil tin back in, snugged the lid, and set it on the shelf by the salt and the little horn spoon. Then she went to the doorway and stood with her shoulder against it, looking again at the 2 tin cups. If there was a place inside her that made a sound, the sound tonight was not crying. It was something else. A hairline crack of wishing, no more than that, where the heat of the day had been. The sky went to iron, and then to something like velvet worn thin. Stars weren't out yet, but they were there, ready. Nora pulled her shawl close. She didn't need it much. The day still spilled itself out of the walls, slow and faithful. Habit made her reach across the jamb and push the shit ductor wider, not because anyone was coming, but because houses breathe better when the lungs are open. She thought that and scolded herself for the thought, then let it be. The goat pen gate gave its small voice again, and she crossed to it. The wire she'd set a few minutes before had slid. She twisted it once more and set the stick at a better angle. Her thumb found the old groove there, the one cut by the person she used to be. She wiped the splinter's dust against her skirt and felt the fabric give the good rasp a working skirt gives. After that, she pressed her palm to the top rail of the pen. It had warmed all afternoon and only now began to return the favor. There's comfort in a thing that gives back in its time. She didn't talk much, hadn't in years. When she did, the words came like tools, plain, meant for use. Still she heard herself say, not to the yard exactly, enough to get through tonight. Saying it twice made it settle. She didn't lean on promises any more than the fence posts leaned on air, but she allowed herself to think of a tomorrow, and that was some kind of sin or some kind of grace. She could not tell which, and she was not a theologian. Back to the porch, back to the 2 cups. She brought her own to her mouth and found it almost cold. The other's metal caught what remained of light, a narrow line along the rim. It made a small halo of nothing around a nothing, and she smiled once, the way you smile at a child doing a trick you won't encourage. She would have gone in then and set the latch and wound the cloth about the handle to keep it quiet. She would have taken her book of tallies and squared the numbers she kept about feed and fence, and she would have folded her body into the narrow bed just this side of tired. All of that was arranged, the way a day arranges itself, and then the world changed a 1/4 inch. It changed with the sound a knuckle makes when it meets old wood. Once true, then again the same. And once more calm as a man who knows how to wait. 3 knocks, not timid, not bold. The kind a body makes when the road has taught him patience. They came through the evening like a hand placed on a shoulder you had thought was empty. Nora didn't move. Not at first. The long shadow that the porch lamp threw lifted itself across the sill and lay there like another rail, waiting to be set. She set her cup down without a clink. In the quiet afterward, the goat bell shook once, a nervous little sound that died fast, and the house held its breath with her. She set the cup down without a sound and let the stillness answer the first 2 knocks. The third she answered herself. The door gave easily, oil doing what oil does, and the porch lantern leaned its soft circle out into the evening. A man stood in it with his hat in his hand, trail dust making a pale crust along the hem of his coat, the color of dry caliche. He had a look men keep when there's a child behind them, and they mean to be the weather that takes the first blow. The child was small enough to hide between his elbow and his ribs, and did it without thinking, peeking from that pocket with one round eye and one button eye, held steady in the face of her rag doll. The man didn't crowd the threshold. He left a boot length of respect between his toes and her floor, and in that space she measured his shoulders, the blunt set of his jaw, the day-old shadow along it. She read, too, the way he held his hat low, not like a show and not like a beg, just the way a person asks for a thing he can pay back. He was the one who spoke. "Evening, ma'am." His voice came like creekbed gravel in a slow water. "Name's Boone Harrow. I was told you might spare a roof." She took in the child then, little chin tipped up as if she was getting sized for a taller sky. The doll's canvas cheek had gone thin with loving. There were stitch marks where a careful hand had once tried to keep more of the world from falling out of it. Nora felt that stitch in her own fingers. "How long?" she asked, dry as fence cedar. "Just the night, ma'am," Boone said. "We'll be out of your lane at first light." Behind her, the stove had decided to be company again and let up a long, low sigh. The smell of chicory drifted through the doorway and met the man's dust half a step out on the porch. Nora followed that smell back into herself. Back through the house she kept like a ledger, quiet columns, nothing extra, and weighed the math. A woman alone didn't owe the road a thing, but there was a child behind this man, and there was a second tin cup on her table, cooling itself toward nothing. She opened the door, another half hand. "All right," she said. "Mind your boots." The man tipped his head, one grateful notch. "Much obliged, ma'am." The girl came forward with the caution of a deer nosing a salt lick. The lantern took a shine off her braid where something small had been tied and lost. She did not touch a thing. She didn't even look like she let her eyes touch it. That, more than anything, loosed a thread in Nora's chest. Inside was lamplight over clean boards. The stove shouldering its work, the black pot shifted a little to keep the boil from going mean. Nora stood aside long enough for the pair to pass, then took the lead with a lift of her chin that told the man there was a place to set his hat, and told the girl there was a chair meant to hold small bones without complaint. Boone placed the hat crown down on a peg and kept his hands from wandering the furniture. A man who knew how to move through another person's life without scraping it was a rare sort. "Just one night," Nora said, and the words fell between them like a plank bridging a narrow wash. "Yes'm," he said softer. "Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild." She ladled stew, meat, and beans that had minded the simmer since late afternoon, and set out bread cut square and honest. The spoons found the weight of the cast-iron bowls and made the low, good sound of work being answered. Firelight bent itself on the wall, stretched, and came back again. Evie, which is what Boone called the girl, when he asked her to sit, held the spoon with two hands and made a careful business of it. Boone watched her, not like a hawk, but like a father, trying to see if the world could be trusted a little. He saw the hunks of meat were too much for a small mouth, and reached for his knife without a flourish, cutting the pieces neat and small on the edge of his own bowl. He moved the blade like a man who had learned to keep his hands steady when it mattered, and the little mountain of smaller bites grew in front of Evie as if from nowhere. Nora, who had been following something old and hard in her head, moved a step toward the hearth and reached for the ladle again. She added beans to the girl's bowl, not a lot, just enough, and slid it closer in one smooth pull that kept the bowl's feet from complaining on the board. "Much obliged, ma'am," Boone said a second time, "for the portion and for the way of it." Nora didn't answer. She poured water into a cup for the girl and coffee for the man. There was a moment where she reached, without letting herself know it, to set a second tin cup for Boone, but she chose the stoneware instead and left the tin where it waited outside with the night. The choice set itself in her, both a keeping and a promise she wasn't ready to make. Evie ate in measured bites, eyes down, the rag doll set on the table with the dignity of a guest. When she was done with the first small hill of meat, she touched the doll's cloth arm with one finger, then looked up. "I like animals," she said, very soft, as if the words were new and she wasn't quite sure of the shape. Nora heard herself answer in a voice that surprised her. "A few goats, some hens." One old mule thinks he knows more than me." The child's mouth made what might be a smile if the wind had allowed it to be bigger. She nodded once, grave with the weight of such news, and returned to her beans. They ate without the need to keep up a talk. The fire shouldered the better part of the conversation. Spoons found their way and came home. A log broke its back into coals and settled. When the bread was done and the bowls lightened to the honest ring they make when they're empty, Nora rose and took dishes to the basin. Boone moved to stand, too, but she shook her head once and he let the chair hold him. She washed, set the bowls to drain, and wiped the table with a damp cloth that carried a memory of lie and summer. A house does most of its speaking in small moves at the edges, and she knew each of them by heart. Boone's eyes had wandered the way a man's eyes do when he is setting his map to a room. Stove, door, window, latch. Each thing checked for strength and intention. He did it without nosing, and she allowed it because a person with a child needs to know what stands between him and the dark. His gaze stopped at the half-stitched saddle on the chair. He didn't look long, a decent thing not to. "Spare room," Nora said, pointing with her chin down the short hall. It still smelled a little of cedar and the dust of clothes once folded and worn by people who no longer stopped by. There was a quilt she had pieced in a dry year when her hands could not sit still. She'd mended it twice since, though no one had slept under it but her thoughts. Boone stood then, careful of his chair. "We won't trouble you, ma'am. Be gone at first light." She nodded once, the closest she had to a benediction. The girl rose with the bowl in her hands, serious as a church usher, and Nora reached for it. Let their fingers meet on the tin, warm against warm. The touch was not long. It did not send a message. It simply put two people in the same world for the space of a breath. That turned something in her she hadn't meant to touch. She took the bowl, set it in the basin, and wiped her hands on the towel hung by the stove. "There's water in the pitcher," she said. "Basin's on the dresser. Sheets are clean." Boone hitched his hat against his ribs like a pledge. "Much obliged, ma'am." The words came again, but with them a piece of tiredness. Honest, not put on. He turned at the hall mouth to let the child go in first. Evie looked back once, not at the man, not at the room, but at the goat pen through the open door. There was a way a child from the trail counts animals, like she's counting chances. Nora recognized the arithmetic. When they disappeared into the short dark, the kitchen held still the way a place holds its breath during a storm that may pass or may sit down. Nora poured what coffee remained into her own tin cup, took 2 drinks, and set it beside the other cup on the porch, rim to rim. The night took the heat from one and left the other as it found it. She stood a while there, letting the porch boards tell her their story again, hands quiet at her sides. Then she went back to the basin, finished what had been started, hung the cloth, and made the small round of the room that told it good night. Latch checked, lamp turned down, iron set safe, draft stopped just enough to keep the coals breathing. Work had the gift of being what it was. It did not ask for more than you gave it. It only asked for all that you said you would. Before she turned the lamp low, she took down a second blanket, thin with years but even, and walked it to the spare room. The door was not closed. She didn't like doors closed, not even other people's, and she had reasons. Boone had set his coat across the chair and set his boots side by side below it. A man who did that had been taught by something that order was a kind of mercy. The girl was on the bed, shoes too, one side, doll between her and the wall, eyes open to a room that wasn't yet hers but could be if it needed to be for a night. "You want the window cracked?" Nora asked into the soft. "Room keeps cooler if it breathes." Evie's voice, barely more than the rustle of the quilt's cotton, said, "Yes, ma'am." Nora moved the sash 3 inches. The night sent in the mildest smell of cottonwood and damp earth from the trough. She tucked the blanket over the thin line of a shin and, without thinking, smoothed once where a mother's hand would. Then she took it back. Some habits you honored by not pretending to have them anymore. "Thank you," Evie said to the ceiling. Nora turned and found Boone in the doorway, one hand on the jamb as if he were measuring the house by feel as much as by sight. He did not step in farther. He did not ask for anything. His eyes said enough, a man trying to keep ahead of the road with a child's pace tied to his own. Nora went past him into the hall, then to the main room, and set the lamp down low. The house went from gold to amber and from amber toward red. She sat on the edge of her own bed and reached to unlace her boots, the leather tongue soft from years of telling the same story. When she lay back, she did it not like a person dropping weight, but like a person finding a place between stay and go. On the porch, the 2 tin cups took their places, keeping watch over a yard that had learned all the ways a night can be long. Out beyond, the windmill gave one tired turn, and the vane clicked. Then even that small bravado gave way to quiet. For a while there was nothing. Then there was the kind of sound a person sleeps inside. The hush of a child's steady breath, crossing the thin wall and laying itself down next to Nora's own. She matched herself to it by degrees until the 2 ran the same trail. 3 breaths, then 3 more. The stove breathed its last good sigh. The boards quit their talk and went to being wood. When the dark finished its work and let go a little, the east cracked the least bit, and a thread of morning stitched itself along the sill. Blue came slow up from the low country, a cold blue that wanted friends. The windmill cleared its throat and rasped once, then twice, as if remembering how to be a mill again. Nora opened her eyes without moving the rest of her. Morning had a voice in this valley, and it was here, calling the day by name. Morning stitched a cold blue seam along the windowsill and kept pulling until the room had shape. The house had slept the way houses do when a child's breath is in them, careful, watchful, a little proud of it. Nora was up on the first turn of the windmill, boots to the floor before the vane found its second rasp. She tied her hair, pushed the door wide, and let the air move through, damp from the trough, sweet with cottonwood and something like clean iron. Boone was already outside. She could see him from the porch, shoulders square to the work and body quiet, as if he were the kind of man who set his weight down into a job and listened for its answer. The trough had been weeping slow at the south seam since spring. He was there with the cedar wedge she kept in a jar by the nails, and a little pot of pitch gone stiff. He warmed the pitch on a shard of tin near the stove while she ground coffee, and now he worked it like he'd been raised to mend things that other folks turned their backs on. Nails bit into dry plank, true, clean sounds, and the wedge rode in close, patient. The dew jeweled the mesquite on the fence line, so each thorn looked gentled for once. Out beyond, the windmill's head had taken to drifting when the wind reached from the east, and Boone watched it between hammer licks, counting the lazy arc. He set the hammer down and shouldered the adjustable wrench as if it were an old friend, climbed to the second rung, then the third. The tower gave the faintest jolt under him, and without show, he set himself so his weight steadied it. He sighted the tail vane, put 2 careful turns on the pivot bolt, then backed them a half breath to let the head swing free. He touched each grease cup with his finger, held it up to the light, and decided. When he laid a line of oil on the gear, the sound changed. The mill took a breath like a man waking without pain. In the pen, the old mule showed the kind of suspicion only long service earns. He stood as if he'd been carved from last year's sun and this year's dust, ears willing to listen to reason but not to nonsense. Boone brought a currycomb across his shoulder and long, slow slides. Dust lifted, a warm animal smell rising under it that made the morning feel honest. The mule's skin twitched to the rhythm of the comb, and his one good eye eased from flint to riverstone. Boone's hand went to the pole, fingers learning the bone there, as if he were reading a scripture that had been badly kept, but still told the truth. Nora watched the small sequence from the porch, coffee in one hand, the other hand working a loop of baling wire by reflex, shaping it into usefulness without needing to look. There was a grace to a man who didn't announce himself and didn't require witness, the kind of grace a house might make room for if the house was in a forgiving mood. She crossed the yard, pointed with her chin at the far post where the fence had heaved its nails in last year's hot weather. "That run wants 2 short rails and a brace," she said. It was as much instruction as she gave on a first morning, and it was more than she had given any man in a long while. She found herself standing closer than she meant to, close enough to see that there were fine, pale lines around Boone's eyes, made by sun and not by squinting at trouble. He nodded once. "I saw it," he said, not to own the idea, only to join it. He went to the woodpile and chose rails by grain and temper, not by length alone. It is a small thing, choosing good wood. It tells more about a man than what he does when someone is watching. He stacked 2 lengths aside for later, then set the rest at his knee. As he measured, he stacked the kindling that had gotten scattered, making 4 neat ranks of it by size. He left room enough between the little stacks, so air could help the fire do its work when called upon. No waste, no hurry. Evie came to the doorway barefoot, hair still holding the pretty kink sleep leaves when it has been kind. She held the rag doll by the good arm, and the doll bore it well. The girl took the morning into her with a narrow breath and a wide look. She found the goat pen on her own and counted the heads, then stepped back so as not to earn a butt, understanding more about goats than many grown people. She let the doll meet the mule from a careful distance, and, when the mule rolled an eye at her and called it square, the thin corners of her mouth lifted, quick. "Breakfast," Nora said, almost to the world. She went to the stove, set the skillet low, and cut slices of yesterday's bread so all their faces could meet heat and get along. The pan took butter like it had been waiting for the chance. She slid eggs in after, not breaking the yolks, and shook the salt horn once. Coffee went back to a small simmer where it could season itself a minute more. She laid a clean cloth on the table, as if guests were a thing that happened in the course of a week's weather. She added a spoon to the set she had put the night before, and did not look at the act as if it meant anything. Little things are best done under a hat. Boone came to the stoop, washed at the basin without scrubbing the skin off the country he had to carry, and stood a moment at the door so his boots would lose the worst of the yard and not gift it to the kitchen. He took his seat where he had taken it last night, the good manners of not displacing himself until asked. Evie climbed onto her chair and set the doll between her and the wall again. But this time the doll looked more like a cousin than a guard. Nora brought plates and set them without survey. Egg, bread, apple butter, dark as a promise. She set the coffee where Boone could reach it, and water where the girl would prefer it. Boone reached to pour for himself and paused long enough to look at Nora in case pouring was a step too far. She tipped a shoulder in a way that counted for, "Go on," and he did. The cup steamed up into his face, and he breathed the smell without making a show of enjoying it. Work puts a man's pleasures close to modesty. Evie set her hands on the table, fingers lined up like fence posts, and inclined her head. "We say thanks first," she said. Not a rule so much as a tradition she hoped would be welcome. Her voice didn't look around the room for permission. It wanted to include the room in its circle. Nora had a great many words she didn't use. The ones she used now were not long. "Works for me," she said. Evie's eyes went closed. Her mouth moved only a little. Boone mirrored the bow of her head and then looked to Nora as if to say, by the smallest lift of his chin, "We stand inside the same weather a moment, if you'll have it." Nora lowered her eyes without meaning to. Habit, perhaps, and in that small lowering the house drew a longer breath than it had dared in years. They ate easy. The knife found the bread, the butter found the bread, and the bread found the skillet, and came back itself, but better. The yolks broke in a way that said the day might too, but not yet. She set a little apple butter on Evie's plate. The girl touched it with the tip of her finger as if she needed to introduce herself to sweetness. Outside, the windmill took to turning more sure of itself, oil making its business quiet. When the plates had said what they had to say, Nora rose, and Boone rose half with her, sitting back when she waved him down. She carried the plates to the basin and set the blade to the stone. Steel on stone has a voice like truth, plain, not sorry, 2 strokes, then 2 more, then a lighter one to finish. The knife took its edge and accepted it without argument. That sound moved through the room and made even the coffee stand straighter on the table. Boone set his cup down, found the pile of kindling by the hearth, and righted a few pieces that had slouched. It was the sort of tidying that wouldn't be noticed unless you came looking for the luck of it later, when fire went easier. He checked the stove's damper and set it so smoke would not argue with the chimney when evening fell, and tiredness had already taken a person's patience hostage. Nora wiped the last plate and hung the cloth on its nail. "South fence," she said. "2 posts lean. Don't trust the ground there. It slides." "I felt it under my boots," Boone said. "I'll brace it before noon." "Water first," Nora said, meaning the trough. "Goats complain honest." "Yes, ma'am." Evie had finished her bread and was exploring the single crease down the back of her doll's head, tracing it as if it were a stream on a map leading home. She looked up once to the window where the light ran its fingers down the ripples of old glass and made the yard outside ripple back. Her face in that glass took on the look of a person who has found something that will hold for a while. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was a resting place. Boone shouldered his coat because the sun had climbed a notch and wanted its due. He went to the trough, pressed a palm to the patch he'd set, and found no weeping there. He knuckled the edge for luck and moved on to where Nora had said the ground lied. The soil had the slick of clay underneath and the powder of a long season on top. That treachery made of opposites. He set his shovel so the blade bit at an angle, not straight on, and made the hole except the post. He cut 2 short rails from the lengths he had chosen and set them like a letter X between the weak and the strong to make a new thing that was both. He didn't whistle. Men whistling at their own work had too much leisure or too little respect for it. He breathed steady as he pulled and tamped, the sound of air moving through a chest that had been taught by Rhodes to be grateful for each exchange. He looked up twice, once to know where the sun sat, once to know where the woman was, and then went back to the idea of a fence that held. Nora had taken to the yard on the other side of the pens where the grass pushed too tall against the pickets. She swung the scythe with a careful arc, not wide, her shoulders making a quiet circle the way a windmill does when it remembers its duty. The cut grass lay down in thin, obedient rows, and the scent came up green and young, a soft lie over an older world. They met at the pump without planning. She worked the handle and watched the water come up hard and sudden, clear as a new thought. He cupped his palm under it, then dipped his head to the stream, letting the cold find the hot places under his hairline and at the base of his neck. When he was done, there was a small, wet darkness on his collar where it had soaked in. He wiped his face with a bandana that had once been red and was now the color of the road. She stood close enough to see the road in it, and not so close she would have to say anything about it. "Goats'll drink it dry by noon," she said, nodding toward the trough. "Then I'll draw it twice," he said. She allowed herself a short, inward nod. A person could share a ranch with an answer like that. She did not say so. Saying things sometimes breaks them. By noon, the sun had laid claim to the yard with both hands, making the porch shade look like a mercy you had to earn. Nora set a pan of leftover stew to warm and cut onions into it with a quick, even hand. She brought the pot to the table with 3 bowls and let the smell announce the meal. Evie took her seat with the gravity of someone who had learned the cost of frivolity but had not entirely given up the hope of it. She folded her hands again, less ceremony this time, more habit, and Nora found herself lowering her eyes again, without the feeling she was traveling alone to where that gesture went. They ate with the small sounds of contentment that don't try to be heard. When the bowls were light, Boone pushed his chair back an inch and stood. He gathered his bowl and Evie's and carried them to the basin. Nora let him. She moved the coffee pot nearer and poured the last of it into a cup, left it in the middle so any hand could find it. Through the open door the windmill ran steady on its new temper, the grease and the bolt having taken to each other. A red-tail turned over the pasture without interest in goats this size and drifted away. The mule, brushed and made somewhat proud, decided the corner of shade he had chosen would do. Steel on stone came again as Nora gave the knife 2 courtesy passes to keep its honesty. The sound wrote itself into the afternoon the way a good line writes itself into a ledger, firm, no flourish. Boone reached for his hat, then paused. He looked at the door as if listening to what the day had to say next. The yard had gone too quiet. Quiet is a language, and folks who live along a piece of land learn to read it as if it were their own name. It came then, the clean ring of hooves on the rail, not hurried and not ashamed, the kind of arrival that had nothing to hide and too much to prove. Out by the gate, a coat with city hands on it slid from the saddle and dusted off what little the road had dared to leave. The gold wink of a watch argued with the sun. The hat brim made a sharp shade across a practiced smile. Nora felt the air shift like it does before lightning, all the hair along it standing up to see better. She wiped the blade dry and set it down so the edge faced the wall. Then she moved toward the door, not fast, not slow, and the house stood up with her. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. He came on with the air of a man who'd practiced arrivals. The gate latch clicked like a pawn moved with 2 fingers, and then he was inside the fence line without so much as asking it. Coat a shade too fine for this country, boots that had been shined by someone with a basin and time. The road had laid only a polite film on him, and he'd dusted even that aside. Bay rum feathered the air when he took off his gloves, not strong but sharp enough to say where he slept and who folded his shirts. Boone had set his palm flat to the top rail and felt the posts wear in the wood. He put his shoulder to it, a quiet brace, making the fence look stronger than it was without asking the post to lie about itself. Nora didn't step back. She set a half-pace between the stranger and the door and let the yard make up its mind how much of him it would allow. Behind her, Evie had started for the first stare. Curious will makes children tall, and Nora reached a hand back without turning, found a small shoulder by knowing where a child stands, and eased her into the porch shade. The girl moved like she knew a shadow's mercy when she felt it. "Morning." The man's smile lifted the corners of an idea he'd brought along. He set his hat brim just so, enough to show manners without surrender. From his breast pocket came a packet of papers creased into obedience by a precise thumb. The paper made a rasp when he freed it, a notary's weight to it, ink thick and sure. His glove leather, pinched in the other hand, creaked like saddle trees that had never seen sweat. Nora Whitcomb, he said, making her name into a thing he could hold. Silas Vane. The gold at his vest winked once, as if the sun had been invited to the conversation. Boone kept his hand where it helped the fence. The only motion he made was to bring his boots square under him. The wind laid itself down to see better. Sheriff Mellors came in from the lane as if he'd been walking there the whole time and had decided to be here now. He took his place a little off the porch, not on Nora's side and not on Silas Vane's, with the manner of a man who knows the town keeps its own center and he is only hired to mark it. Silas broke the red ribbon on the packet with his thumb, a practiced snap, and unfolded the first sheet so the notary seal caught the light and made honest noise. "Writ from Santa Fe," he said, easy. "Green Table Club, your late husband's notes." He let the paper hang where a person might read it if they wished to lean into his pocket. "In arrears. Demand tender by Friday close." Bay rum and warm ink hung together between them. The goat behind the pen took a mouthful of hay and chewed like law moved no grain from mound to mouth. Evie's hand found the rail at Nora's hip and stayed there, calm because Nora's hip was calm. That's how courage works in a house, borrowed sometimes and paid back later. Silas shifted his weight a half-inch to his heels and gave his cuffs the smallest pull, left then right, twice, a thing he did to keep his hands out of worse habits. Gamblers make little vows like that to themselves. The watch in his vest ticked loud enough that a person could hear it if they wanted to. He did things at the pace of that watch. "Paper bites harder," he said softly, as if sharing a confidence, not a threat. Boone's mouth made a thin line that might have been a smile if a man could afford one just then. "Paper needs teeth," he said, setting the words down plain on the ground between them to see if they would stand. Mellors had a small pocketbook he kept as tight as his jaw. He opened it with 2 fingers and wrote a line, without asking anybody for permission, to make record of what was already happening. He did it slow, like he wanted the letters to own themselves. The sheriff's badge on his vest had a smear at its center, and he rubbed at it with the corner of his handkerchief until the smear gave up. Warm metal smell rose off the star the way a stove gives back what it's given. He looked up at Silas Vane and then at Nora, eyes not pleading, not judging, measuring. He took 4 steps to the right, the kind of steps a man learns when he likes to stand equal distances from trouble and the law. Silas smiled the way men do when they pretend to have brought the only answer left in the world. "No need for sour faces," he said. "It's just a paper thing." He turned a little, as if to share a kindness privately. "Truth is, Mrs. Whitcomb, you're sitting on a kindness of your own. That well out yonder draws more than the year's rains. There's a vein under you runs at a slant from the East Mesas. The Combine could put that to use, help a lot of dry mouths. You don't want to stand in the way of mercy." There it was, dressed like Charity, smelling of bay rum. Some men hunger for land because they know it's work, others because maps and plans look handsomer, with large squares marked their color. Silas had a file cabinet somewhere with a drawer labeled water, and Nora's place lived there between 2 blueprints. Nora's face didn't give him anything, neither did her hands. She had put what she carried in places that didn't show. "I settle what I owe," she said, not reaching for the paper. "Friday," Silas said. He made the day sound like a friend you could set your back to. He drew out another sheet, this one quieter about its seal, but more sure of itself. "Foreclosing writ ready-made should the first go unanswered." The glove in his offhand spoke again when his fingers closed, a little crack like a bone you can live with. Mellors drew breath and spoke so the yard would have it on record. "You'll lodge that at the office," he said to Silas, eyes not unkind, not friendly. "Law reads first." Silas shrugged one shoulder as if to apologize for knowing the dance steps. I favor a gentleman's understanding. But yes, Sheriff, we'll observe niceties. Boone stepped away from the post he'd been holding, left the fence stronger by posture alone, and took half a step closer to Nora that didn't crowd and did declare. He set his hands at his sides where any man could see what they were or weren't about. He kept his eyes on Silas's face and not on the paper, because men who handle cattle learn to look at the animal and not the rope. Mr. Vane, he said, you always ride alone to collect dead men's bets? The words sounded like they came from a long way off and had been walking a while to get here. Silas worked the cuffs again, left, right, one more pair. He glanced at Boone with the interest a man shows a dog that might bite or might stand watch. I fetch what's due, nothing more, nothing less. Nora turned her head the smallest fraction to Boone. A person could miss it if they didn't live in the same air. Somewhere inside her chest, a door she kept shut had loosened on its hinge a hair, admitting a thin draught of dread. Not fear the way a child feels it, jump and howl, but the kind that makes you count steps from porch to pen, pen to well, well to door, and then decide whether to move the bucket now or later. Fragile ease went out of the yard like a neighbor who'd meant to stay and remembered a thing he had to do. Evie's fingers curled into the denim at Nora's hip bone and held without clutching. Nora's own hand fell over that small hand and pressed enough to say what words would have fussed at. Mellors folded his pocketbook, slid the pencil down the spine like a bookmark, and took 4 steps the other way, exact as before, as if the yard had to be checked for level with his body. He let his eyes run over the notary seal, and the way Silas held the page, and the curve of the penman's letters. Santa Fe made its cursive with a flourish at the capitals that Lincoln men's didn't trouble themselves with. He grunted once, a noise that could have meant anything or nothing. What it meant was that he had put the thing into his head in a way that would not be shaken out. Silas, finding the silence not to his liking, offered a last thing, slick as the rest, but truer at the core. I'll say it plain, that water vane is worth more than this roof. Your husband sat where you do, and he understood numbers. He tipped his head, offering a substitute for sympathy. Don't let pride turn paper into iron, Mrs. Whitcomb. Friday comes just the same to every fence line. He folded the writs back to their size and set the red ribbon across them like a tongue. The watch ticked once more into the moment, then was quiet. He placed the papers into his inner pocket and smoothed the cloth over them with the heel of his hand. Then the gloves went on again. Left, right, the leather speaking each time. He put his hat back where it told a story about him, which it did. He didn't ask if there was anything else to say. He had said his part and believed in it. Sheriff Mellors touched the badge again and made it shine one shade brighter, as if he could polish fairness onto a piece of star metal. He lifted his eyes to Nora last, then to Boone, then back to Silas. Bring your copy by, he said, same voice he used for strays and weddings. We'll see it to the book. Silas set his boot in the stirrup and swung up without scuffing the saddle, a point he was proud of. He gave the cuffs one last pair of tugs, left, right, settled the seat, and turned the horse with the pressure of his knee that came from practice and not affection. Friday, he said, letting the word fall like a coin at their feet. Then he took the lane at a pace that could not be called hurry and would not be mistaken for leisure. Mellors waited until the dust he'd left was done making a fool of itself. Then he put his notebook away for good, pushed his hat back a notch, and read the sky with a rancher's squint. He looked like he might speak and then did not. He counted out 4 measured steps and ended up standing where he'd be if someone asked him later where he'd stood. Men like Mellors save trouble from being taller than it is. They don't cut it down, just keep it from wearing high boots. He tipped his brim to Nora, the kind of nod a man gives a woman he's seen hold her ground before and expects to see do it again. "Law reads first," he said, a benediction or a warning, depending on who was listening. Then he took the lane the other way. The yard returned to the business of being a yard, embarrassed for a breath at having been asked to host a drama. Boone went back to the fence he had braced and put his palm there again to let the post remember what stood it up. Nora turned to the porch and guided Evie a step farther into the shade. She caught one strand of the girl's hair that had escaped its plait and ran 2 fingers down it to settle it. The girl leaned into that touch, like goats lean into a hand that knows where the itchy place is. From the south, a stack of gray worked itself up out of the low country. The light went thin as a dime, and the tin edge on the feed shed shuddered to show what it thought of weather. A smell like iron come clean before a farrier's fire ran under the porch and up into the room. The wind sniffed along the rim of the roof and found something to rattle. Nora set her jaw so it wouldn't shake with the tin. She looked down the yard to where the cattle shelter wore its patchwork of old sheets and a promise. The south corner had been asking for attention since last winter, and storms don't extend mercy because a person has other business. "I'll fetch the ladder," she said to nobody that needed telling. Boone's eyes went to the sky, then to her, then to the shed. He didn't offer to go first, and he didn't wait to be invited. He set the hammer through his belt and took the coil of rope from the nail where it lived. Together they moved toward the pens, with the steady step people wear when the work ahead will bite and they know it, and they are going anyway. The fence line watched them pass, truer for the hand Boone had laid on it. The windmill swung its face a point and said its piece in a roughened voice. Evie stood at the head of the porch stairs, doll tucked under her arm, and measured the shape of the 2 figures walking out into what was coming. The house pulled itself close as a hen will when rain makes sense of a day. The first chill of it found the back of Nora's neck, but she didn't put a hand there. She put both hands on the ladder instead and shouldered it for the going. The weather had its mind made up and didn't feel obliged to explain. A taste of iron came thin along the gums, that clean edge storms carry when they mean to sit down hard. The air turned wet enough to nip at the skin without doing a person the courtesy of rain. Nora shouldered the ladder, and Boone walked a half pace off her right with the coil of rope gathered in his palm. The feed shed roof fretted at them from across the yard, tin sheets talking in a high rattle, the south corner trying to peel away like a scab that hadn't healed right. At the pens the ladder went up on the slant where the posts made a kind of brace. Boone set his boot and drove the ladder feet deep into the ground with 2 short shoves. He ran the rope over a rafter stub and tied a hitch so simple it could be read in the rain. He didn't offer her the first rung and didn't claim it for himself. He looked once to the sky that had dropped its color to pewter, then back to the roofline. "I'll take the left," Nora said. "That board hates me." It wasn't bravado, it was memory. She knew where the roof kept its grudges. He nodded, nothing wasted. The ladder rungs were slick with the day's breath. Tin met palm cold as a blade. She climbed on the quiet balls of her feet, so the ladder wouldn't complain. Boone came after, not close enough to crowd her, close enough to catch what the weather might try to take. Up on top the world flattened to tin and pitch and the smell of wet nails. Wind skimmed the ridge and took their hats if they let it. They didn't. They worked with brims low and thoughts low, too. The first sheet was easy, a lift and slide, a knee set so the edge wouldn't chatter, Nora's fingers finding the nail holes by learning, not luck. The hammer answered the roof with clean, short talk. Each strike left a ring in her palm that felt honest. Rain started as pea shot, the little mean kind that speaks before its bigger brothers arrive. It ticked the tin and skipped off the ground below, throwing up the smell of old dirt being asked to remember spring. They set a second sheet, and the wind decided it had been too polite. It came sideways now, quick, like cattle changing their mind at a gate. Boone leaned into the weather, put his shoulder to it so Nora could get the corner down. He didn't say a thing. Work put him in a place beyond talk, and she met him there. The third sheet wanted a fight. Nora laid her body across the shine of it and reached for the far line with the hammer ready. Beneath her, under the tin's thin bravado, the board she'd named shifted its temper. It had been wet in one summer and baked mean in the next, and had rotted under that argument. The plank gave without a sound big enough to warn a person. Her left foot found air, then the world moved. The coat yanked at her shoulders. The ladder jumped like a spooked colt. Tin slipped under her belly. She felt the drop begin in the soft center of her. Falling always starts in the place words don't live, and then a hand closed around her wrist with a power that came from bone before it came from muscle. "I got you," Boone said. His voice cut clean through the roof noise and the wind's quarrel. Not loud, not soft. A rope thrown true. He had one knee jammed into a crosspiece and his free hand locked on a rafter lip. Their weight made a small house of them, and the storm ran around it. Nora's boots scrabbled for a line and found the top of a batten. She drew her other hand in slow, not fighting the pull, and laid it over Boone's fist like a second knot. "Don't let go," she said. "Ain't about to." They breathed those two little lines into the same length of air and lay there flat, the rain stitching them to the roof with 1,000 small pricks. It fell like a seamstress with no patience, fast and sure, and then steadied into something they could work inside. The tin went from knife to friend under their ribs, cold giving up its first anger and settling to business. Nora let her forehead rest on the back of her wrist a moment. The wet there tasted of iron and old memory. A grin came up in her mind uninvited, broad, sunlit, the kind that made slow days go faster. "Home by dusk," he'd once said, swinging to a horse that had always been too much for him, and just enough. The sky had looked near like this, low and stubborn, and she'd laughed at him for talking to time like it was his to order. He'd laughed back with that easy faith some men get born with. The storm that night had reached into the valley and shook the house by its shoulders. She had stood where she stood now and learned what a promise weighs when it doesn't come back. There had been a different fall then, inside the part of a person where the world keeps its ledger. No hand had caught her. She had hit and let the ground teach her about living in the slow after. Wind shouldered them again and brought her back into her skin. Boone's grip didn't change. If anything, it learned her wrist better, bone and tendon and the small pulse that says a person is insisting on staying. The oddest thing wasn't the safety of it. Safety is a stranger in a storm. The oddest thing was how her chest loosened around the place fear had made tight. Not like crying, not like breaking. More like a board, learning it could be straightened by a careful hand and a nail driven true. "All right," she said, to him, to herself. She didn't bother to sort it. On 3. They climbed the count together, 1, 2, 3, and she slid the heel of her boot onto the batten and rolled her hip up onto the sheet, pulling against his hand until her balance came cussing but honest. He never took the weight off his knee or the look off her. She didn't ask him to. When she was set, he let go the way a man eases a gate shut with cattle behind it, slow, making sure he isn't giving anything away. He means to keep. They went back to it. Boone swung his body over the windward edge and made himself a breakwater. He took the weather on his back without fanfare so Nora could get the last nails down proper and not the kind a person curses later. She set the head of the nail where the tin would accept it and drove it clean. The hammer's ring sharpened and then softened as the sheet settled into its place in the world. The rain walked through heavy and then lighter. Thunder moved off with its pride hurt. the light loosened by degrees until the yard below began to have shapes again, not just notions. On the last run of the ridge, she swallowed a curse because the nail she wanted had got itself under her knee and bit her. She grinned at it like it had told a joke it hadn't earned, and Boone, seeing the expression without knowing the story, gave the nearest thing he had to laughter. A breath pushed out through his nose that made the rain at his lip jump and die. They came down the ladder the way they had gone up, careful on the slick, and the ground received them without asking for a price. The goats, who had taken shelter beneath the shed, came out and pretended they hadn't been sensible. The mule lifted his head once, decided the world was still working, and set it back on the fence rail as if to say he would take his watch later. Thanks. Boone flexed his left hand, shut his fingers, opened them. A black sliver of roof edge had set itself neat along his palm. He ignored it long enough to set the ladder down where it slept, and to coil the rope careful instead of throwing it angry. Nora took his hand without announcement and turned it palm up to the light that had come back shy. The splinter lay there a fraction under the skin like a thought a person tries not to have. She fetched the sewing needle from the pocket she kept it in. The old instinct of a woman who understands roofs and shirts, both, and warmed the tip in a match flame she held close, not touching. She breathed on the skin first, the way mothers do when they don't remember learning and remember anyway. Warmth wakes the surface just enough to make it give. Then she picked the edge and drew the sliver out slow as thread through canvas. The black line rode free, and she pinched it in the cloth, tied his palm with a strip torn from the inside hem of her own shirt, where a person wouldn't miss it, and pressed the knot with her thumb to seat it. He didn't thank her with words. He thanked her by letting her work stand and by not fussing at the sting. That suited her. She cut the last tail of cloth with her teeth and smoothed once with the heel of her hand as if she were setting a good stitch, flat. The pengate bumped her shoulder as the storm remembered an old grudge and threw one last handful of rain like a child being carried in from a fight. Then the sky changed its mind and moved along. The day stood there, wrung out, newer than it had any right to be. The air smelt of wet tin and juniper bark where the rain had knocked its bitterness loose. Even the ground gave up a sweetness you only get after a hard wash. They went to the porch without hurry and set the hammer and the coil on the planks where hands would find them again. Evie stood in the doorway with her doll pinned to her chest and the set of her mouth close to Brave. She measured the two of them, found all the pieces accounted for, and let her shoulders come down a notch. Nora laid a hand on the girl's crown for the width of a breath and then left it alone. That kind of touch was not a performance. It was a place to stand. Inside, wet clothes gave up their complaint in small drips that found the basin. Boone turned his back in the decent way of men raised right, wrung his shirt and put it on again because modesty and weather require compromises. Nora shook her skirt once, hard, and it remembered how to hang. She set a kettle to thinking and brought 3 bowls to the table. The stove took to its work cheerful as a dog that has been asked to do what it was built for. When the water hummed, she poured it over the last of the grounds and let the chicory stand long enough to take the edge off the storm that had got into their bones. She set a cup near Boone's elbow, without looking, and one near her own. She left the tin cups on the porch because the night wasn't here yet, and some rituals belong to the dark. They ate what was left from noon, with the appetite work gives. Nobody said what the weather had almost done. Saying a thing gives it a chair at the table, and this house didn't set a place for that guest. Evening came on again, not with the hot hand of yesterday, but with fingers washed clean. The yard sat straighter for having been tested and not found wanting. The roof made one last little sound to show it was pleased with itself, and then joined the quiet. When the light finally slid down enough to leave them with the room's red heart showing, Nora wiped the table, set the spoons in their places for morning like that, made morning itself more likely, and turned down the lamp. The stove breathed out the long breath stoves give when they know the day's account has been settled. Boone checked the latch on the back door without being asked and pushed a wedge of wood beneath it to keep it honest. Evie laid her doll on the folded shawl and arranged the fringe to make it look like a decent bed. The house had the hush of a church where no one preaches, the kind that lets a person hear their own heart. Nora stood in that quiet and let it lead her, not toward sleep, not yet, but toward the drawer below the shelf, the one that liked to stick when spring came on and made a habit of it. She put her fingers under the pull and tugged. Same as always. It gave half a hand's worth and caught hard. She knocked the side with her knuckles. Same as always. It should have jumped back and slammed itself shut like a mule backing out of a halter. Instead, there was a soft give somewhere inside the cabinet wood, as if the storm had moved more than tin today. The drawer shuddered, then eased forward another inch. Behind it, the dark did not look like the usual dark. It looked like a hole where a hole had no right to be. She held there with the drawer stuck in her hands, the room's red light trying to see past her shoulder, the house holding its breath the way it does when a quiet turns into a hinge. The latest little drop from her skirt found the floor and made its mark. Boone's chair creaked once and fell still. Evie's breathing, small and even, stitched the space together. Nora set the drawer down easy on its runners and touched the side plank. With the tips of 2 fingers, it had moved. She could feel that. Just a hair, just enough to tell a story a different way. She did not push farther, not tonight. The day had taught her 2 things she could keep. Tin will hold if you meet it, and some doors open better when the night has had time to go quiet around them. She slid the drawer back until it kissed the frame and left it there, a promise waiting on its own rim. Outside, the yard drew up the last of the wet into its roots, and the windmill lifted one slow notch. The house closed its eyes the way a body does when it is tired, and for once, not afraid of what sleep might bring. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. She didn't press the drawer in the half-light. She let the room go quiet around it first, the way you do with a skittish horse. When a house settles after weather, it says so in little ways. The rafters exhale, the floor loosens its jaw, the stove gives a last, contented breath. When those sounds had run to ground, Nora slid the drawer by degrees. The left runner still argued, but the plank behind had slipped from true in the storm and showed the thinnest dark where no dark belonged. She worked 2 fingertips into the seam and felt the ash-smooth edge of a false back. It had been planned careful by a hand that knew how to hide a thing without lying about it. A wiggle at the corner, a grunt under her breath, and the plank sighed free of its own promise. In the hollow, a leather pouch rubbed so sleek with years that it had the shine of river rock, and a bundle of letters tied with a twine gone dark from handling that did not belong to any days she'd had lately. She carried both to the table and set them near the stove where the coals had gone past orange to the color of heart's meat. The heat there wasn't the greedy kind, just enough to let the room stop clenching. Paper speaks different near warmth. She cut the twine with a thumbnail, and the letters let out that dry little wicker only old paper makes. Ink faded to the color of evening water. Some pages sanded where a person had tried to correct a word with patience instead of tearing the whole thought out by the root. Nora read, without moving her lips, names she knew, and names she'd only ever heard on the wrong side of a story stepped up out of the paper. Gideon Pike sat between the lines like a burr in a saddle blanket, never the subject, always the cause. A paragraph from a ranch downriver told how men with city coats offered protection for water rights, and left a well fouled with kerosene when they weren't bought. Another, from a survey hand in a careful, ashamed script, said the plats had been corrected at night, stone markers lifted and set back in a new truth to suit the combine's thirst. There was Santa Fe ink and Lincoln dust on those pages both, a map made of warnings and favors called in too late. One letter she set apart without meaning to. It was short, old, written by a man who put his strength in fence posts, not flourishes. They came again. Same men in nicer shirts. If they push toward Rio Hondo, make ready to ride, Eliza. She stopped on the name, felt the old misname a friend had used for her, as a joke and a comfort. Don't wait on law, they own pieces of it. TL. The initials had the square certainty of a man who only signed what he would stand under in a storm. She laid that page down like a thing alive. Boone had not sat himself. He'd been listening from the doorway, boots quiet in the habit of men who learned the worth of stillness. He came to the table when her shoulders dropped the smallest degree, not to read over her. He wouldn't crowd a woman's grief or a woman's business, but to be the weight a table sometimes needs to keep from listing. She turned a few pages so he could see without having to lean. He read faster than he talked, eyes taking the measure and filing it in layers, names, places, the slant and curl that tell whether a man rode under a lamp with a full belly or by a coal with a pistol laid across his thigh. Pike, he said, not a question. The way a man names a weather he's stood under before. She nodded. There was nothing graceful in it and nothing weak. Combine buys the blue lines on a map first, he said after a spell, and the brown ones follow. She folded the letters back to a stack and slid them into the leather pouch. The pouch took them like a mouth closing on a promise. Her thumb found the part of the leather that had been sternum once, the place where men press the thing they keep close when the road turns and they don't know yet how. She could smell old ink and cabinet oil on her fingers now, the same sweet woody gave of oak that had kept these secrets hidden and breathing behind the stuck drawer all these years. What now? She asked the room, not Boone and not the stove. Then she looked at him anyway. Boone didn't stand at angles to choices. He laid them out flat. He reached for the flour sack she kept for polishing spoons and spread it smooth on the table. He used a stub of charcoal from the ash bucket and set the world down in rough lines. The Rio Hondo swinging its elbow around the low mesquite, the arroyo cutting like a careless knife, the feed grounds, the pass, the turn at the black basalt bluff, then Lincoln, 2 boxes for courthouse and church, a longer smear for the main street that took its time about deciding to be straight. Josiah Bell, he said, tapping Lincoln with a blackened knuckle. Circuit man, he knows land the way some men know poker. Had him once on a boundary fuss outside La Luz. Kept the plat honest when the other side tried to shift stone at night. He'll read this paper and see what it pretends to be. He marked the route with little crosses, not for distance but for trouble. 2 water holes that still hold in summer. Bad ground here, clay on caliche, don't push. Arroyo's throat narrow here. If a man was aiming to crowd, he'd do it at this gash. Sun'll be to our right by 2 hands when we pass. Keep it out of your sights if you can. Evie had drifted in on bare feet, her doll under one arm, sleep still pressed into her cheek. She didn't come close to the table. She stood where a child stands when grown folks are making shapes out of danger and calling it a plan, head cocked like a bird's to follow the line of Boone's finger as it walked across the sack. Nora didn't make speeches when her mind was set. She rose, crossed to the porch, and lifted the empty tin cup where it waited in the night air. It had kept its cold because that was its nature. She brought it in and set it beside her own with a space between not touching, but close enough that if either one spilled, the other would catch. She stood in that small ceremony like a person at a graveside or a christening. You honor a thing by how you place it, not by what you call it. Boone had gone to his saddle while she was gone, and returned with a strap and an awl. He set them on his knee, and worked at her stirrup leather without comment. The storm had stretched it a hair, and the stitch at the point of wear had opened like a mouth ready to claim a boot. He chose thread heavier than pride, and nested it into the awl so it would pass clean. He pulled each bite through and laid it with his thumb so the seam would sit shut as a healed cut, tight and true. He trimmed the tail and warmed the wax with his breath to smooth it. A man could say a good many things, or he could fix the one small part that makes the whole trip safer. Work talks for a body when the mouth would only get in the way. Nora threaded a needle, too. The little doll's button eye had been gone since before the road turned toward her yard, but there was a watchfulness about the one that remained that had troubled her since the first look. She brought out the tobacco tin where she kept oddments, hooks and eyes, a bone button that had belonged to a shirt no one wore now, a penny bent by a train and saved for luck by a person who didn't have any. The button she found matched nothing and everything. Flat, black, plain. She set it where an eye ought to be and made the stitch go and come, careful that her thread didn't snarl, careful that her breath didn't move the world more than the small thing could stand. When she finished, the doll did not look new. It looked seen. Evie stood closer without realizing it, a hand's breadth then two, and set her palm on the table edge, not to claim it, just to be near where something good was being made. Nora tied off the thread, bit it, and pressed her thumb to the knot to set it. She put the doll back in the child's arms and kept her hand there a second longer than she needed to. Evie did not say, "Thank you." Her shoulders did. In the quiet that followed, the coals made their small cave breath. The stove's belly glowed in a red that only comes after a day like this. No show left, just heat. The room grew a hush to fit it, the kind of quiet that can hold a decision without spilling it across the floor. Boone rolled the flour sack with its charcoal marks and slid it into his coat as if it were a thing of value. The leather pouch went into Nora's own bag, the letters now a weight she could count on, not a hollowness she'd pretend not to hear. He looked to the window where dawn has to come from and nodded toward it like a man nods at a partner he trusts enough to take the next turn. "We named the dust," he said. 3 words, as much oath as plan. "At first light," she answered. They moved through the house with that agreement folded between them, the way you fold a quilt for a hard night and leave it ready by the bed. He checked the cinches by touch, not by eye. Let his palm read the leather to see if it would take strain. He oiled the head of the pump so its first morning pull wouldn't cry out and tell the world more than it needed to know. He counted cartridges without setting them loud on the table and slid what was needed into a pouch where they wouldn't knock against each other and talk. He laid his hat crown down where it would keep its shape while the night did its last work. Nora walked the room in a small circle that made the house feel less alone. Lamp turned down but not dead. Banked coals set tight to hold a heartbeat in them. Latch set so it would give kindly to a friendly hand and stand stubborn against an unfriendly one. She took the 2 tin cups and washed each under a trickle, set them on the sill to dry mouth down, then righted them and set them on the table, rim to rim this time because some distances had closed since dusk. When she was done, she went to her narrow bed and lay on it like a person lays down a question at a place where questions are kept safe until morning can answer. Sleep came in the way it sometimes does when a choice has been spoken out loud to the dark, quick, then deeper, the kind without dreams. The stove kept its vigil. The wind made a low sound in the gable, as if talking to itself about other roofs it had known. Somewhere in the yard a goat turned on its knees once and settled. They rose before the rooster remembered what his job was. The night had pulled back only a finger width, and dawn was a line you could rub away if you breathed on the glass hard enough. Coffee gritted the pot and came dark. Bread took a scorch on one side and was fine company anyway. Nora packed light, shirts that would forgive being washed in a cold creek, biscuits wrapped in a towel that had seen better tables, the pouch with the letters slid deep, where even her own hand would have to look for it. She took one tin cup and put it in the bag. The other she left on the table where it could keep watch for them, like a lamp no one needed to tend. Boone brought the mule and the mare around. Saddles sat as if they'd been made for those backs and no other. He checked the stirrup strap he'd mended and gave it that last tug men give to a job they trust but will not flatter. Evie came quiet, doll to her chest, braid not yet tied. Nora set the second button in that plait, with fingers that had learned the road's knots and the ranches, then tucked the end under so it would hold. She lifted the girl by the waist and set her behind the saddle horn, where a small hand could find leather and know it. "Warm," Boone said, handing Nora a kerchief. The morning had a bite in it, a small one, but enough to teach you how much necks belong to weather. They took the yard at a walk, not to wake it violent. The house, seeing them go, did that thing houses do. It held still and tried to look like it wasn't looking. The windmill turned once like a slow nod. The gate latch lifted as if of its own accord and then let them through with a soft metal sound that felt like luck choosing to be ordinary. They had the lane to themselves. East showed the first threadbare edge of day, a stitch laid along the mesa lip. The country ahead had its usual lies and one or two new ones. Boone kept them 3 yards off the arroyo lip, where the ground likes to give, and Nora watched his hat brim for the small tilt that means change your weight now. They rode in that silence that is more than a lack of talk, it's a pact. Up on the far rim, high where the black rock makes a tooth against the sky, something flickered that wasn't sunrise. A horse's shoulder showed for a blink and went away. Pebbles let go somewhere above with that shy little clatterstones make when they forget themselves and fall. Boone never looked up. His voice found her in the cool air without having to travel far. "Trail's watching," she answered by easing Evie closer to the saddle and setting her own hand back along the child's shin, the way you do when you intend to be the ground if the ground fails. Ahead, the arroyo narrowed to the place marked on a flour sack by a charcoal stub. The day took a breath and held it. Then they went on. The arroyo took them in the way a throat takes a swallow, close, darkened, and not entirely by choice. Black basalt walls lifted on either side, faces pocked where old water had tried to argue with rock and lost slow. Sand banks along the bends whispered as their edges sloughed by grains, a soft, steady betrayal. The day's light made a white knife on the upper lip of the cut. The sun was 2 hands right and high enough to flash the rock's mouth like a threat. Down in the slot the air held a sour marsh taint, old puddles gone shallow, a lick of mineral that made the tongue pull back. Somewhere above, grit ticked down in lazy, careless falls. Each tiny patter, a breath counted. Boone eased them off the main path into a ribbon of shade, where the wall had bowed once and never recovered. He dismounted without sound, took the reins in 2 fingers, and brought the mule's head close. His palm found the pole and pressed there, slow, the way a man quiets a skittish thought. The mule's breath came wet and steady against his wrist. Boone lowered the muzzle with a slight pull until bone learned another shape. less likely to flare or squeal when rocks spit back voices. He squatted and scuffed 2 narrow lanes into the sand with the edge of his boot, lines flaring toward the left rim and the right bend, firing windows shaped by what the arroyo would allow. He pointed with 2 fingers flat, left for him, right for Nora, then curled those fingers back to his palm and held them there, counting nothing aloud, only the lift of knuckles under skin. His mouth didn't move. His shoulders did, the muscle, at the neck easing into decision like a team taking their colors. 2 lanes. I cover left, he said, gravel in a slow stream. Nora swung down after him and caught Evie by the waist, set the girl where the wall's seam ran cool as old water. Stone breathed against their backs, damp at the deeper line, the smell of limestone and something like pennies kept too long in a pocket. Nora put her palms over the child's ears, not to shut the world out, but to make it come from farther away. She felt the small bones of jaw and temple, and the precise lives inside them. The doll slid from Evie's arm in the arranging and lay on the sand with one new button eye catching a half-light. "Hold the girl, I see it," Nora said, the words low and regular, a fence wire drawn just tight enough. Evie nodded once, her face tipped into Nora's shirt, so that breath warmed the fabric and turned its weave into a slow geography. "I'm okay, ma'am." It wasn't bravado. It was a child declaring where she would stand inside the fact. Up on the left rim, a horse's shoulder showed again, one blink of hide against sky, then went to stone. The first shot came from there anyway, rolled off the lip into the slot with that hard, close thunder only tight places make. Chips came off the basalt like a black rain struck by spite. Sand jumped and fell back flat. Boone leaned into the lane he'd drawn and answered with 2 clean measures, not fast, not wild. His carbine shouldered as if it had been carved from his ribs. He didn't reach for more than the arroyo would give. He made the bullets speak flat and low to the rim where the glint had been. Right side, another muzzle flared. The sound came brittle through the bend. Nora could not see the man, only the dust of his intention, feathering the lip where light cut it to powder. She pressed Evie deeper into the seam and let her body make an angle over the child that would turn a shot shallow or not at all. The rock took Nora's shoulder cold. Through it ran the tiny shivers of ricochet, tapping the stone skin like mean rain. Boone lifted his left hand where she could see it and showed her the count against himself. 1, 2, 3. It was not a signal to his rifle. It was a signal to hers. He wanted the right lane to become mean on 3. She wet her lips, sighted the bends dark, and rode the count with him in her chest. On 3, she lifted the Spencer's barrel, stock already against warm bone, and let the front sight settle where the arroyo's teeth bit in. She did not shoot, not yet. She waited on his next breath and then gave the bend one warning, high, so the man would think the rock had teeth too. Another crack from the left came hot. Boone shaved it with a shot that didn't try to be a hero, just tried to own a sliver of the rim long enough to make the other man blink. The mule shifted a hoof, and Boone's hand returned to its pole. One easy stroke, and the animal put the foot back down, as if bowing to a lesson. He touched the headstall's cheekpiece and eased it a notch, so leather wouldn't squeal when it carried fear. A round came in low, mean, flat, kissed a stone at Nora's side, and jumped. Something white flicked past her eye, delicate, slow, like a moth forgetting which way keeps it alive. Evie's hat ribbon, cut neat, wavered down and fell against the sand, a pale line on red. The girl didn't make a sound. Nora felt the absence like a thunderclap in a church and put her palm harder over Evie's ear, the other hand open and ready across the small back, like holding a fence for a calf that hasn't learned gates. Boone tapped the ground with 2 knuckles, moved, then held up 2 fingers, 2 yards, and then pointed with his chin there. He shifted first, a shadow unpeeling from shade, crossing the gap on the belly of a breath, setting himself behind a broken basalt shoulder that had forgotten it was part of the wall. She pulled Evie with her in the seam's shelter, one hand on child, one on Spencer, feet remembering the ground's little lies and stepping around them. The sand gave with that dry hush and then kept what she'd taken from it, covering their prints as if even the arroyo had decided to take sides. From the left rim came a new kind of talk, closer, quicker. Somebody in a hat too clean for this place cursed the way city men do when the world quits obeying paper. Boone sent 2 more steady sentences up there and made the talking stop for a breath. On 3 again, he murmured. Fingers, 1, 2. A stone somewhere above them gave up and rolled. It didn't rattle. It ticked once on an angle and then ticked again. Polite, like a fork set wrong on a plate. That single sound lifted every hair on the back of Nora's neck. The arroyo held its breath. When the stone took the last small tumble and tapped out on the sand, the quiet hurt a person's teeth. Position blown. Nora swung her sight where Boone had wanted it, felt the Spencer settle into her shoulder as if it had come there by choice, and let the breath go out of her to make room for the bullet. She didn't pull the trigger yet. She waited for the left to start up again. Boone would pin it, and when it did, she would talk to the right, quick and hard. 2 lanes, I cover left, Boone said again, like a plowman telling a mule what it already knows to keep it from thinking too much. Then he made good on the promise. The left rim spat light, and Boone met it with 3 low shots. Not a spray, placed like nails. Nora counted the beats between each of his and laid her own sight into the dark curl of the right bend. She could smell the cordite in the slot now, harsh and dry, the taste of metal coming up her throat. Her fingers remembered the ladder rung, slick with storm, the tin blade cold under her ribs, and then forgot it again. Fear making a motion and being told no. Focus put its hand on the back of her head and pushed her, muzzle where it belonged. She saw it then, the right-hand hat rise and fall just enough to make a target for a person. With poor discipline, she kept her sight a button lower, where a man careless enough to show brim would have his cheek. Boone's next shot went, and she sent hers with it, sister to it, the 2 bullets taking the arroyo at the same breath, like a team that knows the furrow. The right-hand brim went down hard. The bend held its light inside itself and refused to give it back. Sand slid again somewhere high, a longer slough, and an edge of shadow moved on the rim in a way no rock knows how to move. By the time Nora dragged breath 3 inches into her chest, she'd seen the shape resolve. Horse downslope, rider laying low along the neck, body knife flat, using the caved bank as a chute. The animal slid half on its haunch, half on courage, stones kicking out in little avalanches that came fast and mean. The rider's hand was up, revolver set for a short, right-handed shot, at anything that looked like a face. He had chosen the seam. He had chosen the child. Nora didn't think. Thinking belongs to later. She dropped her barrel a hair and let the world narrow to 3 things: the horse's shoulder, the rider's knee, the space between them where a small miss would still do work. Boone had already swung his muzzle to keep the left blind and loud, throwing iron up there to hold the others back from getting brave all at once. He could not split into more than 1 man. He didn't try. He did the ground's job on the left so the right could be done by someone else. Nora pressed Evie with her body to keep the child from rising into the shot that was about to be, and the girl stayed small and steady, the way a person does when the world teaches her early that moving is sometimes what gets you hurt. The rider came down the last 10 feet like a bad idea that had found a hill and wanted to see how it felt to fly. The ribbon of Evie's hat lay pale on the sand by Nora's boot. It looked like a small path to a larger thing, white against red, useless and beautiful. Nora saw it and did not see it. She felt the Spencer's stock warm along her cheek and the iron front sight steady itself where she told it to. She breathed out. Boone's last shot cracked, held the left. In that space of left being held, Nora took the right. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. In the breath Boone bought on the left, Nora took the right. She let the muzzle come down a thumb's width, enough to make the world sharpen. The Spencer's stock had found the soft of her cheekbone. It carried the thin warmth of worked wood, the kind a person's skin remembers and leans into without asking. The front sight steadied where the rider's knee rose off the sliding horse, bone and leather and bad intent, all lined up in the narrow mercy the arroyo allowed. She breathed the last of her air out until there wasn't anything in her chest to shove the barrel aside. The trigger broke like a stitch, snipped clean. The shot struck the arroyo's tight air and made the kind of sound close places make, a hard report that hit the walls and came back smaller, meaner. Cordite bit the nose and ran salt along the tongue. A hot casing skipped from the Spencer's gate, kissed her knuckles and skittered down the sand with a thin, insect scrape. The rider folded in a clumsy grace, knee buckling, shoulder rolling, the revolver kicking itself out of his hand as if it had changed its opinion of him. He cartwheeled once, hat gone, boots describing a useless arc, and landed on his back in the shallow wash. The horse screamed the sharp, tearing scream horses have when a man has lied to them, slid the last yard on its haunches, and came up, shaking, nostrils rasping wet. Sand raked the arroyo in a curt rush, hissed back into place like breath sucked between teeth. Boone didn't look to the fall. He kept the left blind and angry, putting iron up there where the brim had flashed before, each shot placed like a nail driven to hold a board that wants to work loose. Then he dropped the muzzle to the right and sent a ricochet hard, a flat, skidding shot that clipped stone at a mean angle and went off singing. The last man in the bend, closer than he had any license to be, felt the song whine past his cheek and found his courage had been miscounted. He fired wild at the sound and not the shape, then crabbed back and up, boots losing purchase on the slough bank, hands pawing at scrub that gave way like promises made after whiskey. On the left rim, a hat rose again, only a poke to see if the world had changed, and Boone put a small answer into the rock just below it, a sting to the forehead a man could interpret any way he liked as long as he did it while retreating. The brim flattened. Steps scuffed a rhythm that sounded a lot like leaving. The man who'd come down the slope tried to breathe with his back bent in the wrong direction. He made one sound, an old man's sound in a young throat, and then went quiet. The horse, eyes rolling to white, blue froth, saw edges and decided the arroyo would kill it if it stayed. It found its feet through sand in a yellow sheet and went lurching along the slot, riderless and ashamed, until the bend took it out of sight and the sound of its hooves went thin and then thinner. Silence isn't silence after gunfire. There's the ticking of sand settling on itself, the little music of brass cooling, the drum of hearts getting the message wrong and beating harder for a spell. There was all that, and under it, Evie's breath. Short, ragged, steadying itself one notch at a time against the rock that still held some of last winter's cold in its seam. Boone was there, quicker than the echoes could finish, his body making a wall that learned where Nora's wall ended so the child could live between them. He put his broad hand over the crown of Evie's head, not heavy, firm. Fingers went to her ear, gentle, checking for blood the way a man checks for heat at a bearing, not trusting only what he sees. Her ear was whole. The small drum inside had been shocked by the drama and nothing more. He smoothed her hair once because his hand didn't know how to quit being human. "You're all right," he said. Evie's eyes had gone wide and flat in the shock. Then they focused. They found Nora's face close, sweat salt at the temple. Dark hair stuck to her jaw in stubborn little arcs. The rain had taught it. The girl's mouth opened as if to breathe, and what came out was a word so light it might have been a moth if it hadn't sunk so deep into the air between them. "Mama." The syllables landed without fanfare, two soft feet setting down on floorboards that had been waiting years for exactly that pair. They stood there, those feet, not testing, not running, just being on a ground that held. Nora didn't let the sound break anything. She let it mend. Her hand stayed at the small of Evie's back, a heartbeat longer, a breath longer, until the girl's ribs settled against her palm in a new rhythm she could learn. Then she drew the sleeve of her shirt over her wrist and ran the clean part of it across the child's brow, where powder dust had found the sweat and made a paste. The cloth lifted it away and left the skin underneath small and clear, warm with life. She pressed her mouth to Evie's crown, a touch quick and sure, without ceremony, and let the smell there, sun, salt, a hint of lye soap, tell her what she already knew. The child was whole and here. "Keep moving," she said, because the arroyo didn't care what the word had done to them, and there were still 2 lanes in it that had to be minded. They moved in the seam. Boone kept low and long, the carbine held loose and ready, eyes measuring shadows not for fear now but for numbers. The right bend stayed empty, ashamed of itself the way a place sometimes is after men use it wrong. The left rim offered one last show of grit, a single rock clattering down, meaner in intention than in fact. Boone answered it with silence, which is a kind of strength men don't often learn until they've been alive too long to brag. They passed the place where the rider had fallen. The revolver lay there backwards, barrel to the man's knee like a sari. Boone put the toe of his boot under the gun and sent it into the brush with a short kick. The man had a patch of fine city shirt under his coat. The collar was clean and the throat under it would never clear again. There was a smell where he lay, not the old stink men talk about in saloons. Not yet, but the hot copper whisper of blood, finding sand and being surprised by it. Evie didn't look. Children from the road know what to keep their eyes off. Her gaze stayed on the line of Nora's shoulder and the slope of Boone's hat brim. Those 2 shapes were the world now. The rest could be dealt with later or never. They eased the mule forward, and the animal, keen to the way danger lives in corners, put each foot down like it had been taught to read. Nora kept one hand on Evie's knee and one on the Spencer, not clutching either. The sand under them gave as they went, a soft hush that sounded like acceptance after argument. When the slot widened and the light began to fall straight instead of sideways, the air changed its voice. Heat rose from the basalt, thick and honest, and juniper thread found its way into it, green, resin-sweet, clean as a hymn sung under one's breath. The 3 of them breathed that, and the hearts that had been hammering wrong settled a notch at a time, finding the old cadence, the same one Nora had found in another house, in another life, before nights got long and promises got short. They took a drink at the first bend out of shadow, not a full stop, just the slow, workmanlike pause that says a person means to keep going. Boone handed up the canteen and Nora tilted it to Evie's mouth, careful of not letting the girl gulp. A swallow after fear can make a body sick. Water ran a bright line at the corner of the child's lip. Nora wiped it away with the knuckle of her thumb and put the canteen back with the care people reserve for tools that keep them alive. Behind them, nothing followed but heat. Ahead of them, the country reared back and laid itself out in the honest, pocked way New Mexico has when it's done with theatrics. The road to Lincoln was still hard and still long, but it was open. The sky had taken its blue back from the stone and was willing to share again. They climbed out of the arroyo's throat and found the higher track. Mesquite went low and patient along the flats. Prickly Pear carried their yellow scars with good humor. A raven made a single circle over them and broke off, uninterested. The mule stepped easier now it had sand out from under its hooves. Boone took the lead line in 3 fingers and didn't look back except once, the way a man checks to make sure the world he's leading is still attached by all the right pieces. When the sun swung up to its proper mean place, they saw the first box of town against the pale, the lifted roof of the courthouse like a hand raised to mark attendance. Sound carries strange out here. They heard the session bell before they could see who was ringing it. The note rolled thin, then fat, then thin again, and then lay down on the country as if it had always been there. The bell jarred something in Nora she'd been bracing for without saying so. It wasn't fear and it wasn't relief. It was purpose finding road under its feet. She straightened in the saddle, let her hand slide from Evie's knee to the horn and back again, a small map learned by touch. Boone shifted his weight and set their course down the last stretch toward the whitewashed steps, and the men and women who climbed them when the law had to remember it, worked for people and not the other way around. The courthouse roof lifted ahead of them proper now, 2 stories of hope backed by timber and stubbornness. The bell tolled its last note and let the air go quiet to make room for footsteps. The 3 of them rode into that quiet together. The bell let its last note thin out and be done. The courthouse sat square on its stone, paint chalk white under a noon that had sobered itself. Steps wore the polish of 100 boots, a few knees, and more prayers than any wall ever admits to. They tied off under the cottonwood where the ground held the old damp of shade, and the horses set their weight on a front foot and took the breather that said they'd earned it. Inside, the air had a church's stillness without its promises. Fresh ink laid a clean bite in the nose. Warm beeswax rode up from the candles in little warm hands, and the floorboards complained the way elders do, quiet, steady, letting everybody know they remember worse. Sun cut the tall windows into long rectangles and set dust to hanging like it had been told to stand proper. A fly stitched lazy circles and thought better of landing. They came in without noise. Boone took the back bench with his hat brim low, close enough to the aisle to be useful, and near enough to Nora that he felt her on the same length of wood. Evie sat between them, doll in both arms, small heels not quite finding the rung. Pastor Rowan saw that, stood from his place along the wall, and fetched a thick book with a broken spine from the clerk's table. He set it on the bench and slid it under Evie with the same care he used when setting hymnals in younger hands. "There," he said soft, "world looks better from a little higher." The clerk dabbed his pen and shook it. The mayor, Trumbull, square through the middle, jaw like a chopping block, leaned on the dais as if it were a rail fence and he'd judged 100 calves from there. Sheriff Mellors had found a shadow cast by the corner post and set himself in it, pocketbook already open to a clean page. He drew a rule with his pencil, one long line, and let his eyes go grave the way a sky does before heat lightning, neutral and not asleep. Silas Vane sat 3 rows over with a paper smile that didn't fool the timber. His cuffs had been set just so before he came in. He checked them once, left, right, and then pretended he had nothing to do with cloth. He had a man beside him in a vest, too. Handsome for this county, Combine writ all over his cut, and another with ledger ink under his nails. They stacked their papers like cards and waited for the room to blink. Josiah Bell rose where he'd been sitting, as a man sits at his own kitchen table, loose in the shoulders, ready in the eyes. Old circuit lawyer, boots clean but not proud of it, coat brushed, hair giving up the fight where it meant nothing. He carried a folio that had been wet once and dried and lived after that. The leather puckered in places like an old hand. He nodded to the mayor, nodded to Mellors, gave Nora a look that said he'd seen women stand longer wins than this and stay who they were. He laid the first document out on the table with a palm flat to keep it true. Chain of title, heavy with proper witnessing, the notary's raised stamp catching the light as if it had been waiting all morning to do that trick. He spoke without ornament. Names, dates, descriptions the surveyors love. North 43 degrees west, to a mesquite that was old then and older now, thence to the basalt point that makes a man stop and admire, thence down the draw that had no name until somebody needed to call it something. Deed in fee simple, he said, paid in full. 3 witnesses, all named and unworried about saying so. Recorded with Lincoln by a sober hand, never encumbered since, save a tax paid on the nail. He looked up, not at Silas, not at the mayor, at the room. Law's a plow. It sat there, the line, deep enough for seed. The combine man shifted, smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks the next card will make him taller. He opened his ledger and pushed a sheet forward with a flourish too neat by half. Josiah ignored it for the moment. He had more ground to turn. He lifted the letters with 2 fingers as if they might come apart from having kept their breath so long. He didn't make a show of the twine. They'd already cut that in the quiet of a kitchen, but he set the pouch near so the court could see where truth sleeps when it's scared. He took the top sheet and read not all of it, only the parts that proved the thing without cutting the story's throat. Names used plain, he said. Gideon Pike behind Combine Holdings. Offers to protect water if deeds rewritten. Threats, then damage. Wells fouled, markers turned. Miss Ada Finch, schoolmarm with a spine made from maps and hymn staves, stood from her place by the window. She smoothed her skirt in the old way, not nervous, orderly, and walked to the table with an envelope, held the way a person carries a chick that needs warmth and witness both. She set it down like a fact. The room could smell the glue where somebody with city hands had sealed it. She opened it with a letter knife from the clerk's drawer and laid the single sheet face up. Them that prefer not to sign sent this, she said. Her voice was the kind that carries children through long winters and short tempers. Said they'd shut my school if we didn't see sense. Said children learn obedience before sums. She looked at the mayor, then at nobody. They threatened kids. A sound ran through the benches, not a mutter, more like a heavy man shifting his weight. Pastor Rowan's hands found each other and held fast. Mellor's pencil made a small knot at the end of the line he'd ruled, and then waited. Miguel Ortega came forward in a shirt sleeve with black dust in the folds and sun drawn into the back of his neck. He set 3 iron stakes on the wood, old corner markers, square-headed, nicked by time and men. He put a hand to each, like naming a son. Markers turned nightly, he said. He pointed to the little scars near the shoulders, fresh file on old metal. You can taste it, he added to no one, and then did, rough fingertip to rough iron, a smith's habit. Not my work, not any honest work I know. Seamus O'Rourke, who had built more hinges than he had friends and prayed with his hammer, gave a grunt like a man rising. He took an iron from the clerk's small brazier, fed it 2 coals, and set it to the wick of a dipping pot. The beeswax softened first, sweet and yellow, home-smelling, then took the color of a little wound when he stirred a cinnabar chip into it with a nail. Red came up from the bottom reluctant, then complete. He watched it go, patient. For the seal, he said, more to the iron than to the room. He took one of the stakes Miguel had set down, turned it in the light until a stamp showed shallow, a clover leaf inside a circle. He set his thumb in the old mark and closed his eyes a second. Smith's stamp, he swore, hand on iron. Belonged to Tom Driscoll before me. He never turned markers or men. He looked up, and I'll swear it where it counts. He did not raise his voice when he said counts. He didn't need to. Silas Vane shuffled his ledger page like he was airing linen. He stood and let the red ribbon on his papers show, the notary seal winking as if it wanted to change sides. He spoke to the room as if it were a congregation he had bought pew by pew. The words came easy. The math was meanness dressed tidy, house debt, club account, signatures a man could make you believe if you didn't know the taste of a pen held under duress. He smiled like the world had agreed to simpler rules, and only this corner of it hadn't got the circular. It didn't take. Maybe it was the way his cuffs got a check, left, right, when Ada laid that envelope down, or the way Miguel's thumb came away with an iron tang and not a lie. Maybe it was the beeswax, breathing honey into the corners, or maybe it was just that Nora stood with her hands quiet, and the room found itself deciding who was the honest weather. Josiah didn't bother to look at Silas until he'd put the last letter back into the pouch and set the string across it like a scar that had healed right. Then he turned, hand out. "Let's see your miracle paper," he said, like a man asking for the salt. The combine clerk brought it forward. Better ink than sense. Signatures where they didn't belong. A notary's name borrowed from a county 3 days' ride, and long dead besides. Josiah ran a finger just under the lines, not touching, close enough to let the paper admit the lie. He cocked his head once, then turned it so the mayor could read the date without squinting. "There," he said, friendly as spring. The mayor leaned, read, leaned back, his jaw set. Mellors, without being beckoned, stepped up and wrote a small note in his book. The notary's year wrong by one, the seal pressed over a fold instead of flat, the signature in a neat school hand that didn't match the old man who'd owned the name. He did not say a word. He let the pencil sit heavy on the paper like a nail, waiting for the right hammer. The room's heat moved from shoulders to faces, not angry, awake. People in the benches stopped trying not to breathe. You could smell salt on necks now and the faint, acrid fear of men in good vests who realize a town can read. Evie's feet found the rung then. She had grown a pinch in the last hour. She sat straighter on the book Pastor had given her. From there she could see her mother's hands folded loose. Boone's thumbs hooked easy on his belt, nothing in them that would frighten a child, and everything in them that would frighten a bully. Nora didn't speak. She didn't need to. Being stood there all the way up her, and that's a testimony the law understands if it's old enough. The letters at her hip had weight that facts recognize. Her eyes moved once, to Ada, to Miguel, to Seamus, to the pastor, to Mellors, a circle that held. Outside, a wagon rattled past on the street and reminded the courthouse of its plain duty. Inside, the clerk coughed and regretted it. Beeswax ticked in the small dipper. The pen in the clerk's hand drew one wet breath and steadied. Mayor Trumbull straightened, and the wood of the dais gave a small, wordless assent. He lifted his hand, not high, palm out. The room went more quiet than it had before, which is the only kind of real quiet there is. He looked at Seamus and then at the clerk. His voice didn't have to travel far. "Bring the seal," he said. Seamus glanced to his pot, and the red beeswax gave back a slow pop along its skin, like something satisfied to be useful again. It simmered, warm and ready. The sheriff's pencil hung where it was a heartbeat longer, then came to rest beside the line he'd already ruled, like a plow laid down at the end of a furrow waiting for the turn. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Seamus came with the seal as if it were a sacrament. Iron warmed on the small brazier, beeswax gone red as a pricked finger. The pot gave a soft, pleased pop, one then another, like something waking to its old purpose. He tipped just enough onto the clerk's ribboned packet that it pooled glossy, a coin of crimson waiting to harden. Mayor Trumbull didn't clear his throat or grandstand. He just reached for the brass, set its face to the wax, and leaned the weight of his shoulder through his palm. The room could hear the parchment complain under him, low crackle like a dry creek bed settling after rain. He held steady. Then he lifted. The town's seal stood proud in the red, edges clean, no air bubbles, no lie. The beeswax warmed the room with a sweet, homely breath that had nothing to do with courts and everything to do with kitchens. He gave Mellors the nod a brand gives a foreman when the iron's right. Mellors stepped into the light from his strip of shadow and took the paper without a flourish, as if it were a post-hole digger or a feed sack. Tool, not trophy. He read in the voice he used to count cattle at dusk. Slow enough to own it, fast enough to move it along. Claim denied, fraud suspected, restraining order served herewith on Silas Vane and agents of the Dry Creek Combine. His pencil touched the margin once. Repeat offense fined at $20 per day of trespass, assessed against person and employer. Property seizure to include the horse ridden to the offense. He lifted his eyes, level as a water table. Custodial sentence 10 days in county jail on contempt. Standing warrant should he flee. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of room. The floorboards took the words down into themselves with the same patience they gave to nails. Ada's chin came up a shade. Miguel let air go through his nose he hadn't known he'd been holding. Pastor Rowan's hands loosened, met again, steadier, as if a prayer had found its footing under new law. Josiah Bell didn't look at Nora while he worked. He looked at the paper and then at Silas, because that's the order of things if you're honest. "Mr. Vane," he said, ordinary as weather, "the court will have your receipt withdrawing your claim today. You'll sign to it, and you'll let 10 of these folks witness you did, so it doesn't forget on the way home." He slid the clerk's ledger forward. The steel nib on the desk scratched its own dry warning as the clerk set it upright and fed it ink. The sound took a tiny bite out of the room, a cat-tongue scrape, definite and unlovely. Josiah placed his finger at the blank line and waited. He had a farmer's patience for men who thought stubbornness was the same as spine. Silas's smile had gone thin as old paper. He looked at his cuffs, left, right, and set them just so, then thought better of letting his hands be seen to fuss. He took the pen like it had insulted him in a saloon and bent to the line. The way he formed his S told on him. Fancy where plain would hold better, a loop too proud for the work it was asked to do. The nib scraped, then bit, then settled. When he was done, his name lay there, true as far as ink can make a thing true. He dropped the pen, then remembered manners enough to set it back in its rest. "This ain't over," he said, voice husked now the wax had cooled. Josiah didn't move. 10 signatures move law, he answered, not looking up. He tapped the ledger, then called names without ceremony. Ada, Miguel, Seamus, Pastor Rowan, Old Man Barrow from the feed store, Miss Lydia from the laundry, Trujillo who hauled freight, Hennessy who'd broken 3 teams and never a promise, Mrs. Benton with a baby on her hip and ink on her thumb, Jeb Price who couldn't write more than his own name but made it big and square and proud. One by one they came. The steel nib took their marks and made more of them than their owners would have. The page blotted a little, like a field drinking. Each hand looked how a life looks, cramped from washing, broad from hammers, careful from teaching, scuffed from ruck. It made a kind of hymn to labor without anyone having to sing. While the ledger drank, Mellors did the part the badge requires, and decent men sometimes hate. He took a fair copy of the order and rolled it with the tie flat. He slid it into a leather tube and buttoned the flap, then stepped out through the side door where a boy had been holding his bay in the square. He tied the tube to his own saddle with a square knot. Any scout would be proud to call clean. He ran his thumb along the edge of the paper, once under the leather, to feel it there, law made physical, under hide, and patted the horse's shoulder because good animals carry more than men admit. He came back in and placed the service copy in front of Silas, just long enough for the man to see what his name looked like when wrapped for travel. "I'll enforce it," he said, "no more, no less. If a man's going to make a vow in a courthouse, it ought to be one he can keep with his hands." Seamus O'Rourke, who could read the tremble in another man's palm the way he read the heat in iron, moved without asking. When the clerk slid the deed across for Nora's touch, Seamus's broad paw was there under her elbow, steady, respectful, like bracing a joist until the weight finds its post. Her fingers closed on the parchment. It crackled back, thin, loud, alive. She didn't clutch it. She held it as a person holds a child's hand at a street crossing. Not to own, to guide. Silas had come half up from the bench on whatever anger professors use as kindling. His hand went to his vest, habit looking for a watch that could reschedule fate. He found only the tick that kept its own counsel. He checked his cuffs, left, right, again. Twice in quick order, less ritual now than a man trying to wind himself past a moment. He swallowed, and the room heard it without malice. That's the thing about small towns. They don't pretend not to hear you swallow when you must. He tried then to square the paper off into a story he could like. "Combine will appeal," he said to the air, as if the walls lay awake nights worrying about such things. "Law reads first," Mellors said, not unkindly. He took the tube on his belt one notch tighter. A quiet left his mouth that said he knew how to sit a hallway and a night both with equal patience. Silas gathered his papers, crisping their corners with fingers too neat, and made a show of leaving without retreat. The sheriff stood a half-step sideways, the sort of step that means nothing if a man means to go where the law allows, and everything if he doesn't. Silas went where the law allowed. The doors gave back daylight to him the way a river gives back a stone, without much opinion and with more weight than he planned to carry. Nora hadn't moved but for breath. The deed had weight that wasn't in its ounces now. It had the heft of names put down and not crossed out. It had the heft of wax cooled square and red. It had the heft of 10 hands in 10 inks that had turned their small into a together that bit. Something eased inside her that wasn't relief. Relief is thin and goes off quick. This had thickness to it, like a beam seated true after a long worry. Law by itself is only lines and pride. Law with neighbors becomes a tool a woman can lean a house against. She looked once to Boone, not to ask anything, not to tell. His hat brim hadn't lifted. He had the expression mules have when they've decided a ford will stand, and they're right. Evie's fingers had been sitting quiet in Nora's skirt this whole while. Now the child's hand went small and fierce around 2 of Nora's, squeezed once, and stayed. The little bones weren't asking, they were agreeing. "Record it," the mayor told the clerk. The clerk set the invoice and the deed in their place, weighed them with a paperweight shaped like a river stone, and reached for his pen. The nib took the parchment and left its black there with a small satisfaction. The gavel came down once, a simple, honest rap that would have sounded at home in a barn as much as here. That was enough. Outside, the light had turned from noon silver to a kind of honey that finds everything it touches and says, "Stay while you can." The doors swung and laid that color across the floor in 2 thick bands. Dust motes, not the courtroom's formal kind, but the kind that carries hay-sweet and wheel iron and far-off coffee, rolled in on the light and made the place less like a room, more like a town. Nora tucked the deed safe. not under her blouse like a thief with a gain, but in the pouch where letters are kept, like bones. Seamus's hand left her elbow, having done its small duty. Ada caught Nora's sleeve in passing and squeezed once, the sort of squeeze women use when there isn't time for talk. And talk wouldn't carry the freight anyway. Miguel tipped 2 fingers off his brow. Not a salute, not quite, then went to see about his team. Mellors took the side door again, business turning into work in a way that makes sense to a certain kind of man. Josiah put the cap back on his pen, blew once on the wet line, and shut the ledger so the sound of it was final without being cruel. He slid the folio to his chest like a book of psalms and nodded once at Nora, as if to say the rest of the road would have its say too, but they'd given it good company. Silas, halfway down the steps, remembered to set his hat just so. He checked his cuffs, left, right, and let his heel find the first riser with care. The horse he'd come in on stood watching him, with a level dislike horses reserved for men who smell like bay rum and paper. The bay flicked an ear to the sheriff's hand on its rein and decided to be the laws for the afternoon, if need came. Silas swung up light as a lie, and set his mouth to the line stubbornness makes when it believes its courage. Then he rode, not fast and not slow, but with the short-backed gait of a man whose day didn't go the way his watch had told it. Evie tugged, not hard, at Nora's hand. That small squeeze came again, same as before, truer for having found its echo. Nora looked down and found the girl's eyes not wide now, not flat, just looking with a steadiness children grow when someone has chosen to stand in front of them and keep standing. "Come on," Nora said, but it sounded like home's that way, even to her. Boone rose from the bench with that half-lift men use when their backs remember yesterday's fence and their minds remember tomorrow's. He let Nora and Evie go first and took up his place at their shoulder, guard without show, partner without claim. When they reached the doors, he put a palm to one and pushed it wide, and the courthouse let the honeyed light touch them with both hands. They stepped into it together. They came out of the courthouse into a light that had learned honey. It laid itself on their shoulders in a way that made leaving easy and going home easier. The bay dozed where Boone had left him. The mare blew once through a velvet nose and let the afternoon into her. Nora set a hand on Evie's back to guide, not to hurry. The deed rode in the pouch at her hip without flaunting itself. Law had teeth when good hands held the hammer. She could feel that weight as a steadiness, not a burden. The road back did what roads do when a town's breath has gentled. It unspooled quiet, a little heat wavering above it, a hawk scribbling lazy loops in a sky that had grown patient. They passed the basalt bluff that remembered every bullet and forgot every speech. Mesquite held its green under a skin of gray. The mule moved like he was counting fence posts. No one asked the day for more than it had. By the time the windmill shouldered itself up against the line of their place, the sun had gone from brass to soft coin. The yard looked like a man who'd had a hard talk and decided to sit right. The patched roof kept its counsel. The pump waited without complaint. The porch boards held a warmth they hadn't earned, but took anyway. Evie slid off the mare, landed light, and went straight to the goat pen with the quick purpose children find once they can breathe again. Boone loosened cinches by feel and set saddles on their pegs without thumping them as if noise could bruise the house. Nora went inside and the room recognized her. It drew in its edges the way a shawl pulls to the throat at evening. She took the pouch out and set it in the cabinet's second shelf, not hiding, not displaying. The drawer that had stuck all its life opened and shut easy now, polite about its secrets. She washed her hands in the tin basin, wiped them on the hem of her old dish towel, and set out flour as if it were something holy. Apple waited in a bowl, skins flashing the last of the tree's pride. Cinnamon and nutmeg lay brown and sure in their little sacks. Like country spices, no, they aren't city frippery, and don't mind. Evie's face reappeared in the doorway with the look of a messenger who brings a thing she means to fix. "Kids limping," she breathed, then stopped at the threshold the way children do when they aren't sure which room a problem belongs to. "Bring him," Nora said, and the girl disappeared and returned with a small, indignant bundle under both arms, bone-light, heart-hot, the kid's breath rapid as stitching. Boone met them at the stoop with a strip of thin cane he'd shaved from a busted crate slat and a length of soft cloth pulled from his shirt tail. He didn't take over. He set the cane on the step, put the cloth in Evie's hands, and watched the girl's mouth square itself into the shapework makes. She knelt and steadied the small leg the way a person steadies a thought. One hand gentle at the joint, the other finding where the break wasn't and tying there because splints want to hold the neighbors, not just the trouble. Boone slid his knife under the cane and sliced 2 pieces true. Evie set them either side of the skinny shin, drew the cloth snug but not cruel, and tied a knot a sailor would have knotted at. If sailors had goats, the animal huffed, then went still, because pain understands steady hands when it meets them. "There," Boone said. A whole country sat in that one word. Evie looked up to see if approval was a thing she had to ask for. Nora wiped her floury hands on her apron and came to the stoop. "Good," she said. "Nothing large, nothing small. Work had been done right. That was enough." In the kitchen, butter met flour and made a company that knew how to hold fruit. Nora's knife walked through apples with a sound like thin ice giving under a good foot. Clean, then kinder. Sugar went in the bowl. Nutmeg came last and changed the air to December without bringing cold. Cinnamon unfurled its warm. Flag Evie stood on a chair pulled close and sifted like it was a baptism. Flour rose around her in polite ghosts and settled on her cheeks until she looked like joy had disguised itself as a baker. Boone stepped in and paused where sawdust and kitchen dust meet and have their argument about which smell makes a home. He set his hat on the back peg without mussing the next man's coat, then went to the back door and worked the latch with his pocket knife. The tongue had been catching, whispering about leaving when there was no leaving to do. He polished the brass where a century of hands had taught it to be smooth. A click became a seat, not a catch. He found the wobble in the kitchen table next and kneeled to it like a mechanic's prayer. A sliver of cedar shim went under the short leg. The wobble thought hard about its pride and then gave it up. The table settled into its proper self, quiet as a keeper. He didn't talk. He straightened, brushed wood dust off his palms, and turned to the doorway again. From the yard, the windmill threw a perfect circle of shadow across the hard pan. It reached the threshold like an invitation. Boone wiped his neck with the back of his wrist. Sweat had dried there to salt and grit, and the sting tasted like the day had owed him such a tax, and he'd paid it without argument. Nora set the pie into the oven and closed the door with the small shove old cast-iron respects. Heat gave a little grunt inside like a stove laughing. The smell came out in a practiced hand. First the butter, then the apple rising, then the slow reveal of spice, until the room carried it the way a woman carries a secret she isn't sorry for. Bees began worrying the window, shouldering the screen in a soft, insistent hum, as if sweetness had a bell it answered to. She poured coffee into the tin cup that had stayed on the sill during the ride, and watched steam lift like a veil. She reached for the other cup, the one Boone had carried and set down here once as a stranger, and filled it too. She set his beside hers so their rims made a narrow figure 8, not touching earlier, touching now. Humble mathematics. Boone had gone out again to the stable this time, where the south crossbeam had been making talk about surrender since the storm. He dropped the rotten stick with the contempt a good man reserves for cowards, planned a square on the new one with his draw knife till curls of pine formed soft ropes at his boots, and lifted the beam alone because asking for help is something men do after lifting once to decide whether they need it. He needed it and didn't pretend otherwise. He set one end on a sawhorse, slid the other into the notch he'd cut, and waited there, hip under weight, for a second that stretched. Nora appeared her own self with a mallet. She didn't say anything. She set the far end where it belonged and drove the wedge true. The beam took the house's story into itself and didn't creak about it. They stood a breath under what they'd made and let muscles loosen the fraction work allows. In the stall beyond, a horse shifted and hay made the crisp, clean sound of straw deciding to be useful again. By the time the sun had gone orange at the edges, the pie had poured its sermon into every crack of the house. Nora set it on the sill where a draft could find it, and steam made a little halo. Evie stood on her toes to get her face into it, and the fragrance blessed her without asking for doctrine. Boone came to the door and leaned on the jamb because he didn't trust his hands near a fresh crust. Wood dust streaked his wrists. The day had written its proof on him in gray lines that would wash off. The deeper lines were the right kind of woman reads, without saying out loud. He didn't ask for a word and said one anyway, because there are moments a man has to name or they slide past and turn into a regret. He kept his eyes on the pie, then lifted them to Nora with that sidelong care men use when they bring their heart into a room that has sharp corners. Came to stay, if allowed. For a second, the stove ticked louder. Bees knocked at the screen like gentlemen. Out in the yard, the windmill spoke in a round, even clink. Nora didn't hurry. She lifted the pie with 2 hands and set it on the table. She straightened the clean cloth, set 3 plates and 3 forks, and put 2 tin cups down where steam made its small clouds. Then she looked at him fully, not from the side of anything, and let the yes have its shape. "Supper at 6, she said. "Don't be late." A man could cry at words that plain if he had been holding his breath for a year. Boone exhaled the kind of laughter that has no teeth in it, soft, brief, full. He lifted his cup and drank and let the metal sing to his lip as if the two of them, the cup and the man, had made up their minds to live in the same house. Evening carried itself into the room with a careful step. Bees fussed at the window, a steady argument with a screen they'd never win and never quit. The apple turned sweeter as it cooled, spice going from shout to hymn. Evie had dragged the kid's pen near the door where she could keep an eye while she drew. She opened her small book and sketched in small, stubborn lines. 3 chairs, a square of table, a curve that meant a cup, a tall shape with rungs for a windmill. The kid lay with its splint resigned to being helped. Boone found one more thing to mend because men like him don't know how to be still when the room has a leaning problem. He went to the back step and drove the nail the storm had backed out halfway. No flourish, just a sure wrist and a quiet ring. He ran a palm along the door edge where the planing had been rough a decade ago and sanded it with a scrap until it stopped catching someone's sleeve when they walked in from weather. Nora saw it and didn't speak. Work is a language you don't translate for company. Either they learned it or they didn't. They ate before full dark, crust that cut with a good sound, apples that had kept their shape with dignity, coffee poured again because supper likes it. Conversation was the kind that misses more than it tells and is better for it. Evie's long day leaned against her bones. She blinked, slow. Half a smile kept its post without calling attention to itself. After, Nora stacked plates and Boone washed with a care that made old tin feel new. Spoons rang once in the basin and fell still. The kitchen lamp found its middle, no show, no gutter, and settled. Somewhere from down the lane a soft knock came, hesitant, courteous, not the kind that assumes. Boone turned to look without reaching for a rifle, because not every story is obliged to circle the same winter. The second knock had a companion sound, glass touching wood lightly, then lightly again. Nora wiped her hands on the old towel, went to the door, and opened it on neighbors who had decided a fence line could be a long table if a person chose right. Miss Ada Finch stood first, shoulders neat in a shawl, a lantern in one hand throwing a still circle, a small sack of spices in the other like a peace offering to a day that hadn't asked for war. Miguel had a coil of new wire over one arm and nails in a coffee can that made a bright, merry clatter when he shifted his weight. Seamus came with 2 lanterns dangling from his fingers and a handful of square nails he'd headed himself, the metal gone gunmetal blue from cooling right. Pastor Rowan shouldered a board across both palms, as if carrying a hymn he meant to nail to the evening. "For the fence, ma'am," Ada said, and her lantern slipped a wider light across the yard, catching the windmill's calm swing, the new beam's honest seam, Boone's clean latch, Evie's kid asleep with its cane. The night took all of it into itself and did not argue. Out in the dark, more steps, more low talk. The yard would have company before the stars finished remembering their places. Nora stood with one hand on the door's edge and the other on the tin cup she'd kept. The house grew bigger by that many heartbeats. The work of hands had called its people home, and the people had answered. The windmill sent its round shadow out like a blessing, and the bees gave up their fuss until morning. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. They came the way good weather comes after a scare, soft-footed with hands full, not asking for notice. Ada took the first fence post and lifted her lantern high enough to see the old knots in the cedar. Seamus followed, hooking iron to rails with a blacksmith's ease, a square nail in his teeth, then between finger and thumb, then seated true with 2 small taps that made no boast. Miguel spaced the lights by pulse, not measure, stepping off the posts with his coffee can of nails chiming cheerful, a sound that could have been coins if a man wanted to pretend. Pastor Rowan moved ahead of them with a board across both palms and a quiet that made room for everyone else's noise to be smaller. Lantern glass took the match and made it matter. One by one the wicks fattened to steady gold and leaned against the dark until the fence learned a new job, less keeping out, more calling in. Warm oil breathed a country sweetness. Hot wire ticked as it gave up a little heat to the night. Wildflower breath rode the thin wind from the arroyo, cut with the soft salt of horse sweat, because not everything fine has to be clean. Evie stood on the bottom rail like a bird that had made its mind up to live. She held a lantern with both hands while Ada tied the wire off, and her small face took the light and gave it back to the yard without spilling any. When Ada nodded, Evie handed the lantern over with the gravity of a job given and a job returned, then hopped down, the one boot thump and soft thud of her stocking foot, saying the splinted kid was asleep where she'd left it. Neighbors didn't line up for thanks. They found the places where light would do most good and put it there. The fence learned a rhythm, bright, dark, like breathing. The gate wore 2 lights and looked less like a mouth and more like a welcome. The porch rail got a pair that made the boards look like they'd been planned today. Even the old corral gate, half ashamed of its sway-backed crossbar, got a lantern hung from the hinge and seemed to stand straighter for the honor. "Much obliged for standing," the pastor said when he reached the steps. Not loud, not to be answered. A benediction fit for work clothes. Boone shouldered in by Seamus to take the next hook. He lifted the lantern by its bail the way a man lifts a child, careful not to jolt the flame, and let the wire bite the post where the grain said it would hold. His fingers came away with the shine of oil and a fleck of soot that would mark his knuckles till morning. He didn't wipe it. Some stains earned their stay. Nora watched from the doorway with a cup in each hand, steam writing thin script that the evening read and smiled at. She passed tin to those who wanted it and to those who didn't know they did, until the cup warmed the heel of the hand used more often for swinging and lifting than for being tended. Nobody stayed long with the cup, swallows, nods, a set-down sure as a signature, but the warmth traveled, and that was the point. The windmill turned above it all like a big, patient clock. Boone had hit the bearings with oil earlier in the day, and now the spokes gave a small, even chime at the end of each half-round. A person could time bread by it, or a prayer, or the way a long hurt calms when there's nothing left to prove. The pump rod's head lifted and fell without complaint, a throat cleared and done with. Kids from 2 ranches over came with their fathers, eyes going big and then proper when the men looked. One boy slipped a hand through the fence and touched a goat ear, the way you touch a book, first time you're allowed. The goat decided to be generous and didn't move. Miss Lydia from the laundry tied a lantern to the clothesline post and squared the knot like it was a collar on Sunday. Old man Barrow set a hammer down and took the measure of the yard with his chin. "Holds," he said to no one, which is the same as saying it to everyone. When the last lantern found its hook, Ada smoothed her shawl and took one step back, the way a teacher does when a board is full and the lesson's there, whether children see it now or next winter. Miguel shook the coffee can one last time and smiled at the bright clatter and what it had bought. Seamus spit thumb and forefinger and pinched a hot wick trim. A thread of smoke climbed, then laid itself flat and harmless. The pastor ran his palm down the rail, as if reading Braille. The wood told him what wood tells, how many hands it had known, how much weather, how much more it meant to carry. They didn't make a speech and didn't wait for one. The night carried them out the way it carried them in. Boots soft on packed dirt, low voices, the creak of a saddle that had done an honest day. Lantern light slipped along their shoulders, and then they were part of the dark again. In the good way. The fence kept shining because light doesn't take attendance before it does its job. Inside, Evie found her small book and the stub of pencil that always hid in its curl. She set herself cross-legged by the door where she could look from page to yard without turning her neck. The first marks came in quick, stubborn lines. 3 chairs in a row, plain as fence posts. A square became a table. 2 circles became tin rims. A taller set of lines with steps inside it became the windmill without anyone having to be told. She drew a chain of little suns along a fence she made in crooked squares, and each sun had a handle because she had paid attention. The pie gave one last sigh as it let go enough heat to stop steaming. The room kept the smell. The rest slid kindly into the hall where it would meet anyone late to the table and tell them they were in time. Boone came up the steps and didn't scrape his boots because scraping them would have been louder than the porch deserved. He set his hat on the rail and stood a second where the house shades a man but doesn't hide him. Nora had the blanket over her, arm light as a good plan. Evie had leaned to one side without noticing, the day heavy in her bones, the pencil laying its dark across the paper in a last incomplete fence. Nora took the book from the child's fingers and set it open on the table so the drawn lights could see the real ones. She lifted the blanket and made a small hill of it across Evie's legs, then up to the ribs. Enough weight to say you're guarded, not so much it said you're trapped. The girl didn't wake. She settled, which is better. Boone shook his coat once, the dust giving up without pride, and laid it across Nora's shoulders as a matter of weather and not of gallantry. The weight settled where her collarbone says, "A person is built to carry what's given." He didn't fuss at it. He didn't ask if it was wanted. It was. She set a hand to the lapel a moment in a thank you the night could hold, without having to repeat. They took the porch chairs without claiming them. Tin went to hands. Steam found faces. Fingers learned the dents in the old cups and met them like familiar faults in a friend's talk. Boone's knuckles were still black where lantern wire had marked him. Nora's palm still smelled faintly of nutmeg and thread wax. The two cups knocked once, not hard, just enough to say, "We're both here." Then they sat with heat in their hands and let the quiet finish what the day had begun. Out along the fence, the line of lanterns rode the small breath that rises after sundown. Each glass made a soft, deliberate rock and then remembered center. Crickets tuned up a county over and found their way to this yard by habit. Somewhere beyond the windmill, a coyote wrote a thin sentence into the arroyo and left it to be edited by distance. The wind went down to a polished hush. The oiled mill took it and turned an even quarter, then another, spokes chiming under their breath. 1, 2, like a clock content to keep time for people who had stopped counting. Pastor Rowan paused at the gate once more, hand on post, hat low. Ada's lantern bobbed twice, the whole of her good night. Miguel's spurs gave a shy kiss. Seamus walked off with his hammer hanging from 2 fingers, heavy and easy. Their leaving did not take anything with it. The yard had what it needed to keep. Light is that way when it's given right. Evie slept against Nora's side and made those quiet sleep sounds children have when they've learned the day will let them. Boone's boot found the exact notch in the porch board his heel had made before noon and stayed there, as if it had been saving the place. The 2 cups cooled slow. The blanket held its little hill. A moth threw itself once gently against the lantern nearest the door and thought better of dying for a reflection. It sat down on the rail and counted its wings. Nora let the long stretch of her loneliness fold itself small and put away. Not discarded, nothing that true ever is. Just put where it couldn't run the place anymore. What filled its shape wasn't thunder or fireworks. It was plainer, harder to write down, a room that breathed with more than one set of lungs, a fence that shone because neighbors had decided to do a thing and then done it, a man whose coat knew her shoulders and a girl whose head fit the width of her hand as if hands had been invented for that. "This house has room," she said, the words landing like another nail driven true. Boone didn't answer with words. The cup warmed his lip again. The windmill made its small, measured music. His free hand found the porch rail and spread out there, open, unarmed, simply present. That was answer enough. They sat until the kind of night comes that presses stars down heavy, as if the sky had remembered its job was not to dazzle but to keep watch. Lanterns burned without hurry. The 2 cups lost their steam and kept their shine. The windmill turned when there was wind and waited when there wasn't. Long after talk would have gone sour, the after-images held. A fence of small suns, a pair of dented tins, a wheel that had been seen to and returned the favor. The house listened and, finding nothing to fear left in the dark, let itself belong. That's the shape of it, a house that learned to breathe again. 2 tin cups warm in the dark, a windmill finally turning easy. If a moment stayed with you, Evie's small mama, the red seal cooling, lanterns stitched along the fence. Leave a note on the rail below and tell me where it found you. If this kind of quiet trail fits your saddle, hitch a like to the post. And if you'd ride with us again, hang your lantern on our fence. Subscribe so you can find your way back when the mill sings next. Much obliged for being here. May your road home be steady and your cup keep warm.